Right now, in this very moment, you're probably doing what every human being does. You're fighting something. Maybe it's a situation that won't change, thoughts that won't quiet, or just this constant feeling that life should somehow be different than it is. If you've ever felt exhausted from trying so hard to control everything around you, you're about to discover why a prince 2,500 years ago walked away from unlimited power to solve this exact same human struggle. Tonight, you're going to learn the ancient secret of stopping the fight. Not giving up, but discovering what Buddha called the end of resistance, the doorway to genuine peace. Whether you're listening at 2 a.m. with a racing mind, during your lunch break feeling overwhelmed, or simply seeking something deeper, this story will meet you exactly where you are. If it feels right, share where you're listening from, your bedroom, your car, perhaps a quiet corner of your world where you finally have a moment to breathe. Grab something cozy, dim those lights, and let yourself settle completely. Here's the beautiful truth. Whether you hear every word or drift into the most peaceful sleep you've had in months, this ancient wisdom works even when you're not trying. Welcome to Moonmind Temple, where tonight we stop fighting life and start flowing with it. The journey begins now. There once was a city so beautiful that even the gods would pause in their celestial wanderings just to gaze upon it. Kapilavastu stood like a jewel against the earth, its walls gleaming white as autumn clouds, its towers reaching toward heaven with such grace that visitors often wondered if they had stumbled into a fragment of paradise itself. In this city, darkness was as unknown as poverty, and every street seemed to shimmer with an inner light that made ordinary worries simply melt away. The people who walked these golden streets had faces that glowed with contentment, and children played in gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible colors year-round. Silver moonbeams would dance across the rooftops each night, and by day, when the terraces caught the morning sun, the entire city looked like a river of lotuses flowing gently towards some distant, peaceful shore. Yet for all its beauty, for all its perfection, Kapilavastu held within its walls a story that would teach the world about the most fundamental truth of human existence, that even in paradise, the heart knows when it lives in a cage. King Shuddhodana ruled this magnificent realm with hands both gentle and strong. He was the kind of leader who brought light wherever he walked, whose wisdom drew people like flowers turning toward the sun. Generous beyond measure, just in all his dealings, he had created not just a kingdom, but a living testament to what human society could become when guided by compassion and truth. His subjects loved him, not because they had to, but because his very presence reminded them of the goodness that lived within their own hearts. But even the wisest hearts can be clouded by love, and King Shuddhodana's greatest strength would become his deepest struggle. You see, he had learned something that every parent eventually discovers. That loving someone completely means watching them face a world you cannot control, cannot protect them from, cannot make safe, no matter how much power you possess. And sometimes, when our love runs so deep it touches the very core of who we are, we make the mistake of thinking we can build walls high enough to keep pain away from those we cherish most. The The king had married many queens, as was the custom of great rulers in those days, but among them all, one woman held his heart completely. Queen Maya was her name, and to see her was to understand why ancient poets spent their lives searching for words to describe beauty that seems to flow from some divine source. When she spoke, it was like listening to birds greeting the first light of spring, and her words carried a sweetness that could heal the deepest wounds in any listener's heart. Her hair fell in waves the color of midnight, and her forehead was smooth as polished diamond. But it was her eyes that captured souls. They held the coolness of lotus petals floating on a still pond, and in their depths, you could see a wisdom that seemed to come from lifetimes of understanding. Maya's virtue was not the rigid kind that judges others, but the flowing kind that simply made everyone around her want to be better than they were. She desired happiness for every living being, spoke only truth, and lived her life as an example of what the human heart looks like when it's completely open to love. King Shuddhodana and Queen Maya lived together in a happiness so complete it seemed to bless the very air around them. Their love was the kind that makes ordinary moments feel sacred, and their quiet contentment rippled outward through the kingdom, like gentle waves spreading across a peaceful lake. But life, as it always does, was preparing to teach them that the deepest joy often comes wrapped in the most profound challenges. One night, at the very hour when spring was being born somewhere in the world, a dream came to Maya as she slept peacefully beside her beloved husband. In this dream, she saw a sight so wondrous that even now, 2,500 years later, mystics and sages still speak of it in hushed, reverent tones. A young elephant descended from the sky, moving with such grace that the very clouds seemed to part respectfully for its passage. This was no ordinary elephant, but a being that seemed made of pure light itself. It had 6 great tusks that gleamed like pearls, and its skin was white as the snow that crowns the highest mountains, white as the first light of dawn breaking over a world made new. As Maya watched in wonder, this celestial being approached her with such gentleness that her heart opened like a flower, recognizing the sun. The elephant entered her womb, and suddenly the entire universe seemed to shift into a higher key of existence. Thousands of gods appeared before her, singing songs so beautiful that Maya understood in that instant that never again would she know the small anxieties that plague ordinary human hearts. Hatred could not touch her, anger had no place in her being, and all the restless worries that once troubled her mind simply dissolved like morning mist meeting the first rays of sunlight. When Maya awakened, she felt a happiness unlike anything she had ever experienced. Not the happiness that comes from getting what we want, but the deeper happiness that comes from understanding that we are part of something infinitely beautiful and purposeful. She walked slowly through the palace gardens until she found a shaded spot beneath a tree that seemed to welcome her with its gentle branches. There, surrounded by flowers that nodded in the morning breeze, she sent 2 of her most trusted maidens to find the king. "Tell King Shuddhodana," she said, her voice carrying a new quality that made the maidens want to bow their heads in reverence, that his queen wishes to see him in the garden. "Tell him I will wait here, beneath the flowering tree, for I have something of great importance to share." The king was in his audience hall, surrounded by counselors, listening to the concerns of his people with the patient attention that had made him beloved throughout the land. But when the maidens delivered Maya's message, something in their tone told him this was not an ordinary request. He rose immediately, his heart already quickening with a mixture of anticipation and concern that every husband knows when his beloved calls him with unusual urgency. He found Maya sitting gracefully beneath the tree, and one look at her face told him that something profound had changed. There was a light in her eyes that seemed to come from some inner sun, and her very presence felt different, as if she had been touched by something sacred that had left her fundamentally transformed. He approached quietly, without arrogance or haste, and when he reached her side, he asked simply, "My beloved, why did you send for me? What do you wish to tell me?" Maya told him of the dream she had experienced, describing every detail with the precision of someone who knew she had witnessed something that would change not just their lives, but the course of human history itself. When she finished, she looked at her husband with eyes that held both joy and a strange kind of knowing. "My lord," she said softly, "there are wise Brahmins in our kingdom who understand the language of dreams. Send for them, I pray you, for they will know whether this vision brings us reason to rejoice or cause to mourn." The king agreed immediately, and soon the most learned dream interpreters in Kapilavastu were summoned to the palace. These were men who had spent their lives studying the mysterious ways that the divine communicates with human hearts, and when they heard Maya's story, their faces lit up with an excitement they could barely contain. They spoke to the royal couple with voices trembling with awe. "O king, O queen," they said, their words flowing like music, "a great joy is to be yours. A son will be born to you, distinguished by the favor of all the gods in heaven. If one day he should renounce royalty, if he should leave this palace and live the wandering life of one who seeks truth above all earthly treasures, he will deserve praise beyond anything mortals can imagine. He will richly deserve gifts more magnificent than all the wealth of kingdoms, for he will be adored by all the worlds because he will give them that which they hunger for most deeply. O Master, O Mistress, your son will be a Buddha, one who is fully awakened to the truth that sets all beings free." The months that followed passed like a gentle dream within a dream. Maya carried her child with a grace that seemed to bless everyone who saw her, and throughout the kingdom, it was as if the very air had become lighter, more hopeful, charged with the promise of something wonderful approaching. Then, one day when the trees were heavy with blossoms and the world itself seemed to be celebrating, Maya knew that the time had come. She walked into a grove where nature had prepared the most beautiful of settings, trees so laden with flowers that their branches drooped under the weight of their own beauty. Maya moved among them with the unhurried grace of someone who knows she is exactly where she needs to be, exactly when she needs to be there. She came to a tree that seemed to call to her, its branches heavy with blossoms that perfumed the air, with a fragrance like concentrated joy. Gracefully, she extended her hand and drew down a branch, and in that moment of perfect connection between human and nature, something extraordinary happened. She stood very still, a smile spreading across her face like sunrise breaking over the world, and the maidens who attended her received into their arms a child whose birth made all of creation tremble with joy. At that same instant, Everything alive in the world felt the tremor of something unprecedented happening. The earth itself quivered with delight, and songs and the pattern of dancing feet echoed through the sky as if all the celestial beings were celebrating the arrival of someone they had been waiting for through countless ages. Trees of all seasons burst into flower simultaneously. Ripe fruit hung heavy on branches that had been bare moments before, and throughout the world, the sick were suddenly freed from their suffering. The hungry found themselves satisfied, and those who had been lost in darkness discovered themselves filled with inexplicable light. One of Maya's maidens ran to King Shuddhodana with feet that barely seemed to touch the ground. "My lord! My lord!" she cried, her voice ringing with such joy that everyone who heard it felt their own hearts lift in response. "A son is born to you. A son who will bring glory beyond imagining to your house and to all the world." The king stood speechless for a long moment, his face radiant with a happiness so complete it seemed to transform his very being. He knew in that instant what every parent knows when their child arrives, that the world had just become a different place, charged with new meaning, new possibility, new love that expanded the heart beyond anything it had known was possible. Presently, he summoned all the Shakyas, his kinsmen and nobles, and commanded them to accompany him to the garden where his son had entered the world. They formed a procession that was like something from a celestial court, nobles and wise men, priests and counselors, all moving with the kind of reverent gravity that comes when ordinary humans find themselves witnesses to the extraordinary. When they reached the child, King Shuddhodana approached with steps that were both eager and humble. He made a deep bow before his newborn son, and in a voice that carried across the grove like a sacred proclamation, he said, "Do you bow as I bow before the prince to whom I give the name Siddhartha, he whose purpose will be fulfilled?" Now, in the mountains not far from Kapilavastu, lived a hermit whose name was spoken with reverence throughout the land. Asita was so old that his years could hardly be counted, and his austerities and meditations had made him beloved of the gods themselves. When word reached him of the birth of one who was destined to save humanity from the endless torment of suffering and rebirth, his heart filled with such longing to see this child that he immediately set out for the palace. His arrival at the court caused a stir of excitement, for Asita rarely left his mountain retreat, and when he did, it was always for reasons that proved to be of the deepest significance. His years and his wisdom lent him a dignity that made even kings bow their heads in respect, and King Shuddhodana received him with all the honor that custom prescribed for such a revered holy man. "Happy indeed am I," the king said, "that this child of mine has drawn the venerable Asita to visit our humble court. Command me, wise one, what must I do? I am your disciple, your servant in all things." The hermit's eyes shone with a light that seemed to come from years of seeing beyond the surface of things to the truth that lies beneath. He spoke in a voice that was gentle, yet carried the authority of one who had spent decades in communion with the deepest mysteries of existence. "This has happened to you, O noble and generous king, because you love duty above convenience, because you are ever kind to those who are wise and to those who have lived long and seen much. This has happened because your ancestors, though rich in gold and land, were above all rich in virtue. Know the reason for my coming, O king, and let your heart be filled with joy beyond measure." Asita paused, his gaze turning inward, as if he were listening to voices that others could not hear. "In the air," he continued, "I heard a divine voice speaking words that made my old heart leap like a young deer in spring meadows. This voice said, 'A son has been born to the king of the Shakyas, a son who will possess true knowledge, who will understand what others have sought through countless lifetimes of searching.'" I heard these words carried on the wind, and I came immediately, for my eyes must behold the glory of the Shakyas while there is still time. Overwhelmed with joy and curiosity, the king went immediately to fetch his son. Taking the infant gently from his nurse's protective arms, he brought him to the aged hermit with the careful reverence of one presenting a precious jewel to a master appraiser. Asita looked at the child with eyes that had learned to see far beyond the surface of things, and as his gaze took in the tiny form before him, he noticed marks upon the baby's body that made his breath catch in his throat. These were the signs that the ancient texts spoke of, the subtle physical characteristics that marked one who would become a Buddha, one whose very presence would transform the world's understanding of what it means to be human. For long minutes, Asita simply gazed at the child, his heart swelling with a joy so profound it seemed to encompass not just this moment but all the suffering humanity that this small being would one day help to heal. Then, to everyone's amazement, tears began to flow down the old hermit's weathered cheeks. He sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of lifetimes, and turned his eyes toward the sky, as if seeking some kind of comfort or understanding from the heavens themselves. King Shuddhodana saw these tears and felt his heart constrict with sudden fear. How could this holy man, who had spoken of glory and joy, now weep while looking at his precious son? "You say, O venerable one," the king spoke, his voice tight with anxiety, "that my son's body bears the marks of divinity. You say his birth was wondrous, that his future glory will be supreme. Yet you look at him with eyes filled with tears. Is his life then to be fragile? Was he born only to bring me sorrow? Must this new branch wither before it has burst into flower? Speak, O saintly man, speak quickly, for you know the great love a father bears his son. Do not let me suffer in uncertainty." Asita looked at the king with eyes full of compassion, understanding the fear that gripped any parent's heart when faced with uncertainty about their child's future. "Be not distressed, O king," he said gently, his voice carrying the comfort of absolute truth. "What I have told you is completely accurate. This child will know glory beyond anything the world has yet seen. If I weep, it is not for him or for you, but for myself, and for the nature of time that governs even the lives of hermits who have spent decades learning to transcend ordinary limitations." He paused, looking once more at the child who lay peacefully in the king's arms, seemingly aware of the profound conversation taking place around him. "My life draws to its close," Asita continued, "and he is just beginning his journey toward becoming the one who will destroy the evil of endless rebirth and suffering. To those wandering in the forest of existence like travelers who have lost their way and cannot find the path home, he will point out the road to salvation that leads beyond all sorrow. Therefore, do not grieve, O king. I alone am to be pitied, for I who have practiced austerities through countless seasons, who have meditated until my mind became as still as a mountain lake, will never hear the voice of your Son proclaiming the law that sets all beings free. Yes, even one who ascends to the loftiest realms of heaven is to be pitied if he misses the chance to hear the words that this child will one day speak to heal the world's pain. These words of Asita brought the king a complex mixture of emotions. Relief flooded through him as he understood that his son would indeed live and flourish, would know glory beyond imagining. But then anxiety crept in as he pondered the hermit's prediction that the prince would renounce royalty, would choose the life of a wandering seeker rather than accepting the throne and continuing the family line. Did this mean that at his death, the noble line of the Shakyas would simply end, that all he had built would crumble into nothing? Yet this worry proved to be short-lived, for from the very moment of Siddhartha's birth, it seemed as if fortune herself had decided to bless the kingdom of Kapilavastu. Like a great river whose waters are swollen by countless tributaries flowing in from all directions, new riches poured into the royal treasury each day. The kingdom flourished as never before. The land yielded abundant crops. Sleek cattle grazed contentedly in meadows that stayed green throughout all seasons. Women bore their children easily and without suffering, and men lived in such harmony with their neighbors that conflict became as rare as snow in summer. Happiness and tranquility reigned throughout the land, as if the very presence of this special child had somehow elevated the consciousness of everyone who shared the same sky. But even in the midst of this golden prosperity, sorrow found its way into the palace. The joy that had come to Maya proved too intense for her human form to contain for long. 7 days after giving birth to the child who would change the world, she died peacefully and ascended to join the gods in whatever realm awaited one who had been chosen to mother a Buddha. It was as if her earthly purpose had been so perfectly fulfilled that there was nothing left for her to do but return to the divine source from which she had come. Maya had a sister, Maha Prajapati, who in beauty and virtue was almost her equal, possessing the same gentle wisdom and boundless compassion that had made Maya so beloved. The infant prince was given into Maha Prajapati's care, and she looked after his needs as tenderly as if he were her own child, perhaps even more tenderly, for she understood the sacred responsibility that had been placed in her hands. Under her loving attention, Siddhartha grew with a grace that was visible to everyone who saw him. Like fire fanned by an auspicious wind, like the moon reigning as queen among the luminous stars, like the morning sun rising majestically over the eastern mountains, the prince developed in strength and beauty and wisdom that seemed to increase with each passing day. As the years passed and Siddhartha grew from infant to child to young man, King Shuddhodana found himself torn between pride in his son's extraordinary development and a growing anxiety about the prophecy that haunted his thoughts. He did not want his family line to end with him, did not want to see the kingdom he had built with such care pass into the hands of strangers. I will surround my son with such pleasure, such beauty, such constant delight, he thought to himself, that he will never feel the lack that leads men to seek something beyond the world of the senses. Perhaps if I can awaken in him a deep love for the joys that life offers, I will have grandsons who will carry on our noble lineage. So the king sent for his son one day when Siddhartha had reached the age when young men traditionally begin to think of marriage and family. "My child," he said, settling beside the prince in the palace garden where they could speak privately, "you have reached an age when it would be natural and good to think of taking a wife. If there is some maiden who has caught your eye, some daughter of a noble family who pleases you, tell me, and I will arrange for you to meet her properly." But Siddhartha's answer surprised his father with its directness and its unexpected direction. "I am not one of those who actively seek the company of women, father," he replied thoughtfully. "It seems to me that my destiny lies in living quietly in the forests, where through meditation and contemplation my mind might find the peace that seems to elude so many people, even those who have everything the world considers valuable." The king felt his heart sink at these words, recognizing in them an echo of the hermit's prophecy. But Siddhartha continued speaking before his father could respond. "However, I have been thinking about this question you raise, and I notice that there have been men throughout history who found great wisdom while still maintaining households, still loving wives, and raising children. Does not the lotus grow and flourish even when its roots are deep in the muddy bottom of the pond, even when it's surrounded by tangles of lesser plants? Perhaps I can follow their example, finding the balance between worldly responsibility and spiritual seeking. Give me 7 days to consider this matter fully, Father, and in 7 days I will give you my complete answer." During those 7 days, Siddhartha spent long hours in quiet reflection, considering what qualities he would most value in a life partner, what kind of person could share his journey regardless of where it might lead. He thought not just of beauty or noble birth, but of the deeper qualities that make a true companion through all of life's changes and challenges. When the week had passed, he returned to his father with an answer that was both specific and idealistic. "Father," he said, "if I am to marry, she must be a woman of rare merit in every sense of that word. She whom I marry will indeed have the flower of beauty, but her youth will not make her vain, nor will her loveliness make her proud or cause her to look down on others who are different. She whom I marry will have a sister's affection and a mother's tenderness for all living creatures, not just those she finds easy to love, but all beings who suffer or struggle or seek happiness. She whom I marry will be pure in body, pure in speech, and pure in thought, not the purity that comes from never having faced temptation, but the purity that comes from consistently choosing what serves the highest good. Father, if you know a maiden who possesses these qualities, regardless of her family's rank or wealth, you may arrange for us to meet, for it is not position or riches I seek in a partner, but virtue and wisdom and a heart that naturally flows toward compassion." King Shuddhodana was both impressed by his son's thoughtfulness and daunted by the challenge these requirements presented. He summoned his household priest, a wise Brahmin who knew all the noble families of the region, and carefully enumerated the qualities Siddhartha sought in a wife. "Go, learn one," the king instructed. "Visit all the houses of Kapilavastu and the surrounding lands. Observe the young women carefully, question them skillfully, and if you find one who possesses even most of these necessary qualities, bring word to me immediately. Remember that my son has made it clear. He seeks virtue above all else, character above convenience, wisdom above wealth. The priest undertook this mission with the thoroughness that had made him trusted advisor to the royal family. He visited house after house, met with family after family, observed young women of every rank and station. Some were beautiful but shallow, others were intelligent but proud, still others were kind, but lacked the depth of understanding that the prince required. The priest began to despair of ever finding someone who combined all the qualities Siddhartha had described. Finally, his search brought him to the home of Dandapani, a respected member of the Shakya clan who had always lived with honor and dignity. Dandapani had a daughter named Gopa, and the moment the priest saw her, his heart filled with excitement and relief. Here was a young woman who possessed not just physical beauty, but something far rarer, a natural grace that seemed to flow from inner peace, eyes that held both intelligence and compassion, and a presence that made everyone around her feel somehow more hopeful about life. When the priest spoke with her, asking the kinds of questions that would reveal her character and understanding, he found himself amazed by the wisdom of her responses and the genuine kindness that informed everything she said. She spoke of life's challenges, not with the naive optimism of someone who had never suffered, but with the mature acceptance of someone who had learned to find meaning even in difficulty. She talked about other people with a natural compassion that never slipped into condescension, and her thoughts about the purpose of life revealed a depth of understanding that the priest had rarely encountered in someone so young. Excited by his discovery, the priest returned immediately to King Shuddhodana. "My lord," he announced, his voice bright with satisfaction, "I have found a maiden truly worthy of your son. In all my travels through the kingdom, questioning and observing, I have met no one who combines such beauty with such wisdom, such grace with such genuine virtue." "Where did you find this remarkable young woman?" the king asked, hope rising in his heart. "She is the daughter of Dandapani of the Shakya clan," the priest replied. "Though I have complete confidence in my judgment, my lord, I know that even the wisest advisors can sometimes see what they hope to see rather than what truly is. Perhaps it would be wise to arrange some way for Prince Siddhartha himself to observe this young woman and form his own impression before any formal arrangements are made." King Shuddhodana agreed that this was a prudent approach. He arranged for skilled craftsmen to create many beautiful jewels from gold and silver, ornaments that would serve as appropriate gifts for the young women of the kingdom. Then he sent a herald through the streets of Kapilavastu with this announcement: "On the 7th day from today, Prince Siddhartha, son of King Shuddhodana, will present gifts to all the unmarried young women of the city. Let all who are eligible appear at the palace at the appointed time to receive these tokens of the royal family's appreciation for the grace and beauty that the young women of our kingdom bring to our community." When the appointed day arrived, the palace hall was decorated with flowers and silks that turned the great room into something resembling a celestial court. Prince Siddhartha took his place on a throne that had been specially prepared for the occasion, and one by one, the young women of Kapilavastu filed before him, To each maiden who approached, he presented a carefully chosen jewel, but something curious happened that no one had anticipated. Each young woman who came before the prince was so struck by his extraordinary beauty and presence that she found herself unable to meet his eyes directly. Some lowered their gaze to the floor, others turned their heads away, and still others found themselves so overwhelmed that they hurried past after receiving their gift without daring to look at him at all. It was as if Siddhartha possessed a kind of radiance that was too intense for ordinary perception, a quality that inspired both awe and a strange kind of shyness in everyone who encountered it. Gopa was the very last young woman to appear, and when she entered the hall, something in the atmosphere seemed to shift. She walked toward the throne with a confidence that was neither proud nor timid, but simply natural, as if she were approaching an old friend rather than a prince she had never met. When she reached the dais, she looked directly into Siddhartha's eyes without flinching, without blushing, without any of the self-consciousness that had affected all the others. But when Siddhartha reached for the box that contained the remaining jewels, he discovered that it was empty. In his attention to making sure each young woman received an appropriate gift, he had not kept count, and now he found himself facing the one person he most wanted to honor, with nothing to offer her. The moment stretched between them, filled with a tension that everyone in the hall could feel. Gopa smiled, and her smile was like sunrise breaking over mountains that had been shrouded in darkness. "Prince," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that made everyone who heard it want to lean closer. "In what way have I offended you that you treat me differently from all the others?" "You have not offended me in any way," Siddhartha replied, and those who were listening noticed that his voice, too, had taken on a quality they had never heard before, warmer, more alive, as if something in him was awakening in response to her presence. "You are the last to appear, and I have no jewel remaining to give you." As he spoke, he remembered that on his finger he wore a ring of exceptional beauty and value, one that had been made by the finest craftsman in the kingdom. Without hesitation, he removed it and extended it toward her. "This ring was mine," he said simply, "and now I offer it to you." But Gopa did not reach out to take the ring. Instead, she looked at him with eyes that seemed to see more than his outward appearance, that seemed to understand something about his nature that perhaps he did not yet fully understand himself. "Prince," she said softly, "must I accept this ring from you? Should I take something that belongs to you, something that you value? It seems to me that it should be the other way around. It should be I who offers you a gift, for what could I possibly give you that would equal what you have already given, just by being who you are?" With these words, she turned and walked from the hall, leaving Siddhartha holding the ring and feeling as if something fundamental had just shifted in his understanding of life and relationship, and the mysterious ways that souls recognize each other across the apparent separations of ordinary existence. When King Shuddhodana heard the full story of this encounter, his heart leaped with joy and recognition. "Gopa alone could face my son without being overwhelmed," he thought to himself. She alone showed the kind of strength and wisdom that could match his own extraordinary nature. She who would not accept the ring he removed from his own finger, she, my son, will be your most precious jewel, more valuable than all the treasures in all the kingdoms of the world. The marriage that followed was celebrated throughout Kapilavastu as the union of two souls who seemed perfectly matched in wisdom, beauty, and noble purpose. Siddhartha and Gopa lived together in a happiness that seemed to bless everyone who witnessed it, their love flowing outward like light from a lamp that illuminates not just its immediate surroundings, but spreads its warmth far into the darkness. In time, Gopa bore a son, and they named him Rahula, which means chain or bond, though neither of them could have known then how prophetic this name would prove to be. King Shuddhodana watched his family grow with a satisfaction so complete it seemed to encompass all his dreams of dynastic continuity and royal succession. He was as proud of his grandson's birth as he had been of his son's, and he continued along his path of virtue and wisdom, living almost like a hermit himself, despite his royal responsibilities, his actions guided always by what would serve the highest good of his people. Yet beneath his contentment, the king maintained his determination to surround his son with such constant pleasure and beauty that the young prince would never feel drawn to seek anything beyond the palace walls. Siddhartha continued to live in the 3 magnificent palaces his father had built for him, one for winter, one for summer, and one for the rainy season. Each palace was a marvel of architecture and design, furnished with everything that could possibly delight the senses or comfort the body. In these residences, white as autumn clouds and bright as the celestial chariots that the gods themselves might choose for their pleasure journeys, the prince seemed to have access to every joy that human life could offer. He spent his days in pursuits that would have satisfied most men completely, listening to music played by Gopa and her companions, women whose skill was so refined they could make even the gods pause in their celestial activities to listen. He wandered through gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible abundance, where the very air seemed perfumed with contentment. He had access to the finest foods, the most beautiful art, the most stimulating conversation, and the company of people who loved him and delighted in his happiness. Yet, like a seed that contains within itself the entire tree it will become, something stirred within Siddhartha's heart that all this beauty and pleasure could not quite satisfy. It was not that he was ungrateful or restless in any ordinary sense. He appreciated the love that surrounded him, the luxury that cushioned his every day, the wife who brought him joy, and the son who carried on his lineage. But there was something else, something that whispered to him in quiet moments, something that made him gaze beyond the palace walls with eyes that seemed to be searching for answers to questions he could not yet articulate. In Zen Buddhism, we have a teaching that says even in paradise, the heart knows when it lives in a cage. This doesn't mean that love is wrong or that beauty is meaningless, or that we should reject the good things life offers us. It means that the human soul, when it begins to awaken, recognizes that no external circumstance, no matter how perfect, can provide the deep peace and understanding that we most fundamentally seek. Trying to protect someone from life is like trying to stop the river from flowing. It comes from love, but it cannot succeed because growth and awakening require that we encounter reality directly, in all its complexity and challenge. And so, Prince Siddhartha lived in his golden cage, surrounded by every comfort, protected from every hardship, loved beyond measure, and still, in the depths of his being, something called to him, something that would not be satisfied by even the most perfect of external arrangements. What we resist in our children, we often create, for the soul that is meant to seek truth will find a way to do so, regardless of how many walls we build to keep it safe. Love that tries to control, even with the best of intentions, becomes a form of suffering for both the one who controls and the one who is controlled. The stage was being set for a journey that would take Siddhartha far beyond the boundaries of his protected world, a journey that would teach him, and through him, all of humanity, that the peace we seek cannot be found by arranging our external circumstances perfectly, but only by learning to meet whatever arises with a heart that has stopped resisting the fundamental nature of life itself. One day, as spring was painting the world in fresh colors, and the air itself seemed to sing with new life, someone came to the palace and spoke in Siddhartha's presence about the beauty that waited beyond the palace walls. They described how the grass in the meadows had turned the most tender shade of green, how birds filled the trees with songs that celebrated the return of warmth, and how in the ponds throughout the countryside, great lotus blossoms were opening their petals like nature's own prayer of gratitude. They spoke of gardens where young lovers walked hand in hand, of festivals where people gathered to celebrate the simple joy of being alive, of a world that had broken free from winter's chains and was now dancing with the irrepressible energy of renewal. As Siddhartha listened to these descriptions, something stirred within him that he had never felt before, a longing so deep and sudden it took his breath away. It was like being an elephant who has been kept in the finest stable imaginable, given the best food and the most comfortable surroundings, but who suddenly catches the scent of the wild forest on the breeze and remembers that there is a vast world beyond the walls that have defined his entire existence. The prince felt an irresistible desire to leave the palace, to see for himself this world of changing seasons and natural beauty that had been described with such loving detail. When King Shuddhodana learned of his son's request to venture beyond the palace grounds, his heart filled with the kind of anxiety that every parent knows when their child asks for something that feels dangerous. The king understood that this moment had been inevitable. He could not keep his son enclosed forever, no matter how much love and fear motivated his protectiveness. But he was determined that if Siddhartha must see the world, it would be a carefully prepared version of the world, one that would not disturb the serenity of his son's soul, or plant seeds of the kind of questioning that might lead him away from the throne and the family line. Very well, the king thought to himself, my son shall go out and see the beauty of the kingdom, but he will see only beauty. He must encounter nothing that will trouble his peace of mind, nothing that will make him suspect there is suffering in the world, nothing that might awaken in him the desire to seek answers to questions that are better left unasked. And so the king gave orders that took many days to carry out completely. The city was decorated as if for the greatest festival in its history. Garlands of flowers were strung across every street, bright banners fluttered from every building, and the entire route that the prince would travel was transformed into something that looked like a pathway through paradise itself. The most magnificent chariot in the royal collection was prepared, a vehicle made of gold that seemed to capture and reflect sunlight in ways that made it appear almost alive. 4 horses with coats like polished bronze were chosen to pull it, and their harnesses too were made of gold, so that when they moved, the entire procession would create a spectacle worthy of the gods themselves. But the king's most careful preparations concerned not what his son would see, but what he would not see. Orders went out throughout Kapilavastu that on the day of the prince's journey, all those who were old, sick, or suffering in any way were to keep themselves hidden from view. Every beggar was given enough gold to stay comfortably out of sight. Every person who showed signs of illness was provided with shelter, where they could rest until the royal procession had passed, and every elderly citizen was gently asked to remain indoors until the prince had returned safely to the palace. Only the young, the healthy, the beautiful, and the prosperous were allowed on the streets through which Siddhartha would pass. When the appointed day arrived, the king came to his son's chambers, with tears glistening in his eyes. He embraced Siddhartha with the fierce tenderness of a father who knows he is about to release his child into a world he cannot control, and as he kissed his son's forehead, he whispered simply, "Go." But his heart spoke differently than his words, for every fiber of his being wanted to hold his son close and safe forever, protected from all the harsh realities that waited beyond the palace walls. The golden chariot moved through the streets like a vision from a celestial realm. Chandaka, the most trusted charioteer in the kingdom, held the gold reins with hands that had guided countless royal journeys, and the 4 horses stepped with a grace that made their movements seem more like dancing than mere transportation. On both sides of the street, crowds of people had gathered to watch the prince pass, and their faces glowed with admiration and joy as they caught sight of him. Some in the crowd praised Siddhartha for the kindness they could see in his glance, the way his eyes seemed to bless everyone they rested upon. Others spoke of his dignified bearing, the natural nobility that made him seem like royalty not just by birth but by the very quality of his presence. Still others marveled at the beauty of his features, the way harmony seemed to flow from every line of his face, and many glorified his obvious strength and vitality, the sense that here was a young man in the absolute prime of life, radiating health and vigor like the sun radiates light. As Siddhartha rode through this carefully orchestrated scene of prosperity and joy, his heart filled with a happiness he had never experienced before. The wealth and beauty of his people delighted him. The evident contentment on their faces made him proud of the kingdom his father had built, and the natural loveliness of the city in springtime filled his soul with something that felt like pure gratitude for the privilege of being alive. For the first time in his life, he felt truly connected to the world beyond the palace walls, and he began to understand why some people spoke of life as an adventure worth celebrating. But the gods, those mysterious forces that govern the unfolding of destiny, had different plans for this day than King Shuddhodana had so carefully arranged. In the wisdom traditions, we learn that reality has a way of breaking through even the most elaborate attempts to hide it, for the soul that is ready to awaken will find its teachers in the most unexpected places. What we don't face, we cannot heal, and sometimes the universe itself conspires to show us exactly what we most need to see, precisely when we are ready to receive its lessons. The gods, understanding that Siddhartha's time for awakening had come, decided to pierce through the beautiful illusion that had been created for his protection. They took the form of an old man, ancient beyond counting, and placed him directly on the path where the prince's chariot would pass. This was no ordinary elderly person who might simply be hurried out of sight, but a figure so striking, so impossible to ignore, that even the most determined effort to look away would fail. The man was leaning heavily on a walking staff, his body bent with the weight of years that seemed to stretch back to the very beginning of time. He was worn out and decrepit in ways that made every step appear to be a monumental effort, and the very sight of him was like looking at a living demonstration of everything that King Shuddhodana had tried to hide from his son. Thick blue veins stood out on his arms and hands like rivers, mapping the geography of extreme old age. His teeth chattered not from cold but from the tremors that age had brought to his body, and his skin was a maze of deep wrinkles that told the story of decades of sun and weather and the simple passage of time. Only a few strands of dirty grey hair hung from his scalp, and his eyelids had lost their lashes entirely, leaving his eyes red-rimmed and watery. His head and limbs shook with a palsy that seemed to make every moment of his existence a struggle against his own body's betrayal. He moved with the painful slowness of someone for whom every step required conscious effort and determination, and yet there was something in his very presence that commanded attention, that made it impossible to look away or pretend he was not there. When Prince Siddhartha saw this being, so utterly different from every person he had encountered on the journey thus far, he felt something shift deep within his chest. It was as if he was seeing not just an individual person, but a truth about existence that had been hidden from him all his life. His eyes filled with a sorrow he could not name, and he turned to Chandaka, his voice carrying a quality of urgent confusion that the charioteer had never heard before. "What is this man I see before us?" Siddhartha asked, his words coming slowly as if he were trying to understand something that challenged everything he thought he knew about life. His hair is grey and his body is so bent that he must cling to his staff with hands that appear to have no strength left in them. His eyes are dull and clouded. His limbs shake and falter with every movement he attempts. "Tell me, Chandaka, is this man some kind of monster? Has nature made him thus from birth, or has some terrible accident befallen him? What has happened to transform what must once have been a normal human being into this pitiable figure?" Chandaka should not have answered this question. His instructions had been clear, and he understood the king's desperate desire to protect his son from exactly this kind of disturbing revelation. But the gods, working through the mysterious forces that guide human destiny, confused the charioteer's mind at this crucial moment. Without fully understanding the mistake he was making, without considering the consequences of his words, Chandaka found himself speaking truths that would shatter forever the prince's protected innocence. That which destroys beauty, which ruins vigor, which causes sorrow and kills pleasure, the charioteer said, his voice carrying the weight of universal truth, that which weakens memory and destroys the senses. This is old age. It has seized this man and broken him completely. He too was once a child, my lord, nursing at his mother's breast with the same helpless sweetness that all babies possess. He too once crawled upon the floor, learning to walk as every child must learn, taking his first uncertain steps, while loving hands reached out to catch him if he fell. He grew and became young and strong, with beauty and energy that made him feel as if he could conquer the world. He reached the full flowering of his years, felt the confidence that comes with a body that obeys every command, a mind that grasps every concept. Then, he entered the twilight of his life, and time began its relentless work of wearing away everything he had once been. Now you see before you the ruin that old age makes of every human being who lives long enough to experience its full effects. These words struck Prince Siddhartha like lightning, illuminating a landscape that had been hidden in darkness. His entire body began to tremble, and he felt as if he was seeing clearly for the first time in his life. But what he was seeing filled him with a terror and sadness unlike anything he had ever imagined possible. "Will this fate come to me as well?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "My lord," Chandaka replied, now fully caught up in the momentum of truth, telling that seemed to have taken control of his tongue, "Youth will leave you someday just as it has left this man and every person who has ever lived. To you too will come this troublesome old age that stops our strength in its tracks and steals our beauty like a thief in the night. Time spares no one, my prince, not the wealthy or the poor, not the wise or the foolish, not the royal or the common. It moves through every life like water flowing downhill, inevitable and unstoppable, carrying away everything we think of as permanent and leaving us changed beyond recognition." Siddhartha felt his entire understanding of life crumble and reform in the space of a few heartbeats. He shuddered like a bull at the sound of thunder, uttered a deep sigh that seemed to come from the very center of his being, and shook his head as if trying to wake from a nightmare. His eyes moved back and forth between the wretched figure of the old man and the happy, unsuspecting crowds that surrounded them on all sides, and when he spoke, his words carried the gravity of someone who has just discovered a truth so fundamental that it changes everything. "So old age destroys memory and beauty and strength in every person who lives," he said slowly, working through the implications of what he had just learned. "Yet these people around us continue with their daily activities as if nothing threatens them. They laugh and celebrate and make plans for the future as if they have not seen what I have just seen. How can they delight in gardens and flowers and festivals when this fate awaits every one of them? How can their minds think of anything except the terrible reality of aging? Turn the horses around, Chandaka. Let us return to the palace immediately, for I cannot find joy in beauty when all I can see is the destruction that time will bring to everything I behold." The return journey to the palace passed in complete silence, with Siddhartha lost in thoughts that seemed to spiral deeper and deeper into darkness with every turn of the chariot wheels. When he reached his chambers, he found that peace had become impossible. He wandered through the halls that had once been his refuge, but now every tapestry, every beautiful object, every comfort seemed to mock him with its temporary nature. "Old age," he murmured to himself as he walked. "Old age, old age," and the words became a kind of meditation on impermanence that filled his heart with a sorrow he could not escape. In Zen Buddhism, there is a teaching that impermanence is not the problem, fighting it is. But Siddhartha had not yet learned this wisdom, and so his first encounter with the reality of aging filled him with the kind of resistance that creates suffering. He was fighting against a truth that his protected upbringing had never allowed him to face directly, and this fight was exhausting him in ways that no physical challenge ever had. What we don't face, we cannot heal, and the prince was now beginning the painful but necessary process of confronting the realities that every human being must eventually acknowledge. King Shuddhodana noticed his son's changed demeanor immediately, though he did not yet know its cause. When he learned from other sources what had happened during the journey, his heart sank with the knowledge that his careful planning had failed and that his worst fears were beginning to come true. He decided that perhaps another excursion would help restore his son's spirits, and he issued even stricter orders about keeping all signs of suffering and difficulty away from the prince's path. But the gods, having begun their work of awakening, were not finished with their teachings. Some days later, Siddhartha expressed a desire to ride through the city once again, hoping perhaps that the beauty he had found so delightful on his first venture might help him forget the disturbing images that haunted his thoughts. The king arranged another procession, this time with even more elaborate precautions to ensure that his son would see only joy and prosperity. But once again, the forces of destiny intervened to show the prince exactly what he needed to see, regardless of how carefully his father tried to control his experience. This time, the gods created a man afflicted with a terrible disease and placed him where Siddhartha's path would lead him inevitably to encounter this new form of human suffering. The sick man was a sight that would have moved even the hardest heart to compassion. His belly was swollen with illness. His arms hung limp and useless at his sides, and his face had taken on the peculiar pallor that comes when disease has gained the upper hand in its battle with health. Pitiful cries escaped from his lips as waves of pain washed over him, and he gasped for breath, like someone drowning in invisible waters. The man staggered as he tried to walk, bumping into bystanders who quickly moved away from him, and it was clear that he was fighting a losing battle simply to remain upright. His condition was so obviously serious that those around him looked on with a mixture of pity and fear, some trying to help while others backed away, uncertain whether his illness might be something they could catch. Then, as Siddhartha watched in horror, the man's strength gave out completely and he collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing with spasms that spoke of internal agony beyond imagination. Chandaka, Siddhartha called to his charioteer, his voice tight with shock and concern. "What is wrong with this man? His stomach is grotesquely swollen. His arms appear to have no strength in them at all, and he is deathly pale. Those sounds he makes, they speak of suffering so intense, I can barely listen to them. He struggles for every breath, as if the very act of breathing has become a battle he is losing. I see him stumbling and falling, unable to control his own body. Tell me, what has happened to this unfortunate person?" Chandaka, perhaps still under the influence of whatever force had compelled him to speak truth during the first journey, found himself once again unable to offer the kind of reassuring lie that might have protected the prince's peace of mind. "My lord," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of another universal truth, "this man is experiencing the torment of sickness. Disease has invaded his body like an enemy army conquering a peaceful city, and his weakness grows greater with each passing hour. Yet he too was once healthy and strong, my prince. He too once woke each morning with energy flowing through his body like a clear stream. He too once moved through the world with the confidence that comes from a body that obeys every command. But sickness makes no distinction between the deserving and the undeserving, between those who have lived carefully and those who have been careless with their health. The implications of this revelation hit Siddhartha like a physical blow. Is this suffering peculiar to this one man? He asked urgently. Or does this same threat hang over all living creatures? Could this happen to me, to my wife, to my son, to everyone I love? We are all vulnerable to similar afflictions, my lord, Chandaka replied, his words carrying the finality of absolute truth. Sickness weighs heavily upon the world like a storm cloud that can appear without warning in any sky. No one is immune. No amount of wealth or power or careful living can guarantee protection from the diseases that can transform any healthy person into someone like the man you see before you. When Prince Siddhartha heard this painful truth about the universality of illness and suffering, his body began to tremble, like moonlight reflected in disturbed water. The second great shock of reality was proving even more devastating than the first, because now he was beginning to see a pattern that suggested that life contained forms of suffering he had never even imagined. He spoke words of such bitterness and profound recognition that they seemed to come from some ancient part of his soul that had always known these truths, but had been kept from acknowledging them. People see this kind of suffering happening all around them, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of amazement and despair, yet they never lose their confidence in their own safety. They continue to laugh and plan and hope, as if they possessed some kind of knowledge that protects them from the very fate they witness happening to others. How great must be their wisdom, or how great must be their blindness, that they can live with such apparent peace while constantly threatened by illnesses that could strike at any moment. Turn the horses around, Chandaka. This pleasure trip has ended before it truly began. Let us return to the palace, for I have learned to fear sickness in ways that make it impossible for me to find joy in anything I see. My soul shuns pleasure now, and seems to close up like a flower that has been deprived of light. The prince returned to his palace chambers, wrapped in thoughts that were even darker and more troubling than those that had followed his first encounter with reality. King Shuddhodana noticed immediately that his son's spirits had sunk to an even lower level, and when he inquired about the cause, Chandaka reluctantly told him what had transpired during the second journey. The king's distress was so great that he temporarily lost his usual composure and flew into a rage at the man whose duty it had been to ensure that the streets were clear of anything that might disturb his son. He punished the official, though his natural kindness made the punishment lighter than his anger initially demanded. The man who received this rebuke was completely bewildered, for he had seen neither the old man nor the sick man. They had been visible only to the prince and his charioteer, manifestations of destiny, rather than ordinary human beings who could have been spotted and removed in advance. But the king's anxiety was now approaching panic, and he became more determined than ever to keep his son from venturing beyond the palace walls. He surrounded Siddhartha with entertainments and pleasures of every conceivable kind, bringing in musicians and dancers, storytellers and poets, hoping that beauty and art and constant stimulation might drive away the dark thoughts that seemed to be consuming his son's peace of mind. But nothing seemed capable of restoring the prince's former contentment, and it became clear that once a person has begun to see through the surface of life to the suffering that lies beneath, no amount of distraction can completely restore their innocence. Every ending contains a beginning, and Siddhartha's encounters with aging and sickness had begun the end of his protected childhood and the beginning of his transformation into someone who would understand the deepest truths about human existence. Eventually, King Shuddhodana decided that perhaps one more carefully controlled excursion might help his son recover some measure of his lost joy. He gave even stricter orders than before, personally overseeing the removal of anyone who might represent suffering or hardship in any form. He even replaced Chandaka as the prince's charioteer, hoping that a different companion might be less likely to provide disturbing answers to difficult questions. The king felt certain that this time nothing could possibly go wrong, that his son would finally see only the beauty and prosperity that he had originally intended for him to encounter. But the gods were not finished with their lessons, and they understood that Siddhartha needed to face the third and most fundamental truth about human existence before his awakening could begin in earnest. They created a corpse being carried by 4 men, followed by others who were weeping and tearing their clothes in the traditional expressions of grief. This entire funeral procession was visible only to the prince and his new charioteer, a manifestation of destiny that no amount of human planning could have anticipated or prevented. The sight of the dead body being carried on a stretcher, covered with a white cloth that could not disguise the terrible stillness that had replaced whatever life and movement had once animated this form, struck Siddhartha with a force that seemed to stop his heart in his chest. The weeping mourners who followed behind spoke of loss so profound that their grief seemed to fill the air around them with an almost tangible weight of sorrow. Here was something even more final than old age or sickness. Here was the ultimate truth that all life must face, the end toward which every beginning inevitably moves. What is this being that is carried by 4 men and followed by others wearing dark clothes and weeping as if their hearts have been broken beyond repair? Siddhartha asked his charioteer, though part of him already knew that the answer would complete the terrible education he had been receiving about the nature of human existence. The charioteer, like his predecessor, found himself compelled to speak truth rather than offering comforting lies. "My lord," he said solemnly, "this person has neither intelligence nor feeling nor breath remaining in his body. He sleeps now with a consciousness that will never return, as still as grass or a piece of wood. Pleasure and pain no longer have any meaning for him, and friend and enemy alike have become irrelevant to his existence. The body you see carried before us is what remains when life has departed completely, when the spark that makes a person who they are has been extinguished forever." Siddhartha felt the world tilt around him as the full implications of this revelation sank into his understanding. "Is this condition peculiar to this one person?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Or does this same end await every creature that lives and breathes?" "This same end awaits all creatures, my lord," the charioteer confirmed, his words falling like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread through Siddhartha's consciousness for the rest of his life. Whether they are humble or of noble birth, whether they are wise or foolish, wealthy or poor, beloved or despised, to every being who draws breath in this world, death comes as inevitably as sunrise follows darkness. It is the one appointment that no one can avoid, the one truth that unites every living thing in a common destiny that cannot be escaped through any amount of power or knowledge or desperate bargaining. In that moment, Prince Siddhartha fully understood what death meant, and despite all his courage and strength, he found himself overwhelmed by the enormity of this truth. He had to lean against the side of the chariot for support, and when he finally found his voice, his words were filled with a distress, so profound it seemed to encompass not just his own mortality, but the mortality of every being he had ever loved. "So this is the destination toward which all life moves," he said, his voice barely audible. "This is the end that awaits every person who laughs and loves and dreams and plans for the future." Yet knowing this terrible truth, people still manage to amuse themselves in countless different ways, still travel the world's highways with songs on their lips, still find reasons to celebrate and hope and imagine that somehow they will be different. Death stalks every step they take, yet they dance as if they will live forever. I am beginning to think that the human heart has become so hardened to reality that it can no longer feel the truth that should terrify and motivate every moment of existence. Turn the horses around, Chandaka. This is no time to wander through flower gardens when every blossom we see is already carrying within itself the seeds of its own destruction. How can any sensible person, anyone who truly understands what death means, seek pleasure when they live constantly in the shadow of their own inevitable ending? But even as he spoke these words of despair and disillusionment, the charioteer continued driving toward the garden, where the king had arranged for another carefully orchestrated scene of beauty and entertainment. There, following King Shuddhodana's detailed instructions, Udayan, who was the son of the household priest and had been Siddhartha's closest friend since childhood, had assembled many beautiful young women skilled in dancing and singing, and all the arts that were supposed to delight the hearts of young men. The king had hoped that perhaps feminine beauty and grace might succeed where other forms of entertainment had failed, that the natural attraction between young people might restore his son's interest in the pleasures of earthly life. When the chariot entered the garden, Siddhartha found himself in a setting that would have enchanted him completely just a few weeks earlier. Young trees were heavy with blossoms that perfumed the air with fragrances like concentrated springtime. Birds fluttered about with the kind of joyous energy that comes when nature herself seems intoxicated with the beauty of her own creation. On the surface of clear pools, lotus flowers had opened their petals to drink in the cool air, and the entire scene was designed to be a perfect representation of life at its most beautiful and appealing. The maidens who had been waiting for the prince's arrival rose gracefully as his chariot approached, their faces bright with anticipation and admiration. They moved toward him like flowers turning toward the sun, their eyes sparkling with the kind of excitement that comes from being in the presence of someone whose beauty and nobility seem to emanate from some divine source. Their hands were extended in welcome like blossoms reaching toward light, and everything about their bearing suggested joy and celebration and the kind of innocent pleasure that makes youth so appealing. But Prince Siddhartha was no longer the same person who had once found delight in such scenes. His encounters with old age, sickness, and death had fundamentally changed his way of seeing, and now when he looked at these beautiful young women, he could not help but see them through the lens of the terrible knowledge he had gained. He was not smiling as he had always done before, and the unhappiness that filled his heart was visible to everyone who looked at him. They do not know, these lovely maidens, he thought to himself as he watched them approach with their confident grace and untroubled expressions. They cannot see that youth is as temporary as morning dew, that old age will come and strip them of every quality they now consider permanent. They are blind to the reality of sickness that could transform any of them at any moment from pictures of health into examples of suffering and decay. They know nothing of death, and that ignorance is what allows them to laugh and play and dance as if they have infinite time ahead of them. But I have seen the truth that they have not yet encountered, and this knowledge makes it impossible for me to share their innocent joy. How can I find peace when I understand what awaits all of us? As the day wore on, and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the maidens gradually noticed that their carefully planned entertainment was having no effect on the prince's mood. Their laughter became more forced, their dancing less spontaneous, as they realized that Prince Siddhartha seemed immune to their charms and uninterested in their attempts to please him. He had no eyes for their garlands or their jewels, no appreciation for the graceful movements they had practiced or the songs they had learned especially for this occasion. Slowly, feeling that their efforts were not only failing but perhaps even unwelcome, they ceased their performances and began the journey back to the city, their spirits dampened by the sense that they had somehow disappointed this prince whom they had hoped so much to delight. When Siddhartha returned to the palace that evening, King Shuddhodana could see immediately that his son's condition had not improved, but had, if anything, grown worse. Udayan reported that the prince had shown no interest whatsoever in the entertainment that had been prepared for him, that he had seemed lost in thoughts so dark and consuming that nothing could reach him. That night, the king found no sleep, lying awake in his chambers and wrestling with the growing certainty that all his efforts to protect his son from life's harsh realities had not only failed, but had perhaps made the eventual confrontation with truth even more devastating than it needed to be. Meanwhile, Siddhartha wandered through the halls of his palace, like a caged lion that has been wounded by some invisible arrow. The luxury that surrounded him no longer provided any comfort. The beauty that had once delighted his senses now seemed like a mockery of the temporary nature of all earthly pleasures. Sleep eluded him completely, as his mind churned with questions that seemed to have no answers and fears that seemed to have no remedy. How could people live with such apparent peace when they knew, or should know, that everything they loved would eventually be taken from them? How could anyone find lasting happiness in a world where aging, sickness, and death ruled supreme over every form of joy and beauty? What was the point of building anything or loving anyone if time would ultimately destroy everything that mattered? In this state of profound spiritual crisis, Siddhartha felt a great longing for open fields and green meadows, for space where he could walk and think without being surrounded by the material comforts that now felt like barriers between himself and the truth he needed to understand. One day, unable to bear the confinement of palace walls any longer, he left his luxurious quarters and wandered out into the countryside that surrounded Kapilavastu. He walked aimlessly through landscapes that would once have filled him with simple pleasure, but now his mind was completely absorbed in pondering the mystery of human suffering and the apparent futility of all earthly endeavors. He no longer felt the ordinary emotions that had once governed his daily life, neither joy nor grief, neither doubt nor weariness, neither strong desire nor hatred nor scorn could touch him. It was as if his encounters with the fundamental realities of existence had burned away everything superficial and left him in a state of profound questioning that transcended normal human feelings. The wise person sees what is, not what they wish were, and Siddhartha was beginning to see with a clarity that was both terrible and liberating. As he walked through the peaceful countryside, lost in contemplation that seemed to deepen with every step, he suddenly became aware of a figure approaching him along the path. This was a man who looked like a wandering monk, dressed in simple robes and carrying himself with the kind of dignified poverty that speaks of someone who has voluntarily given up worldly possessions in search of something more valuable. Like the old man, the sick man, and the dead man, this figure was visible only to Siddhartha, another manifestation of destiny, appearing at exactly the moment when the prince was ready to receive the final lesson he needed before beginning his own spiritual journey. "Tell me, who are you?" Siddhartha asked when the monk drew near enough for conversation. There was something about this figure that immediately captured his attention, something that suggested peace and purpose, in ways that contrasted sharply with the anxiety and confusion that had been consuming his own thoughts. "I am a monk," the figure replied, his voice carrying a quality of calm that seemed to flow from some deep inner source of tranquility. "Through fear of birth and death, I have become someone who wanders without attachment to any particular place or possession. I seek deliverance from the very sufferings that you have recently discovered, the endless cycle of aging, sickness, death, and rebirth that traps all beings in patterns of pain they cannot escape through ordinary means. I think differently than other people, for I have learned to see through the illusions that keep most humans bound to pursuits that ultimately bring only disappointment. I shun the pleasures that others chase because I understand that what appears to be happiness is often just another form of bondage. I know nothing of the passions that drive ordinary people to such desperate lengths, for I have found something far more valuable than anything the world of desires can offer." The monk paused, and his next words seemed to come from a place of such profound understanding that they struck Siddhartha's heart like arrows finding their perfect target. "I seek solitude because it is only in deep quiet that the mind can discover its own true nature. Sometimes I live at the foot of a tree, sometimes in the lonely mountains where the wind itself seems to whisper ancient wisdom, and sometimes in forests where every sound teaches patience and every shadow offers lessons in acceptance. I own nothing because I have learned that possessions possess the possessor, and I expect nothing from others because I have found the source of contentment within myself. I wander through the world, living on whatever charity people offer, but my real sustenance comes from seeking the highest good that lies beyond all the temporary satisfactions that keep people trapped in cycles of wanting and disappointment." As soon as he finished speaking these words, the monk began to rise into the sky, ascending like smoke from a sacred fire, until he disappeared completely into the blue emptiness above. This was no ordinary human being, but a god who had taken the form of a wandering seeker in order to show Siddhartha that there was indeed a way beyond the suffering he had discovered, a path that led not to denial of life's difficulties, but to a kind of freedom that could embrace even the most challenging realities without being destroyed by them. The vision of this peaceful monk filled Siddhartha's heart with the first genuine happiness he had felt since his encounters with aging, sickness, and death had shattered his protected innocence. For the first time since learning about the universal nature of suffering, he could see clearly where his own path lay and what he needed to do to find the answers his soul craved. Sometimes we must lose everything to find what truly matters, and Siddhartha realized that his growing disillusionment with palace life was not a problem to be solved, but a doorway to be walked through. He returned to the palace with his mind made up and his purpose crystal clear. The frightened, confused young man who had ventured out that morning had been transformed during his walk into someone who understood his destiny and was prepared to embrace it regardless of the cost. He went directly to his father, bowed respectfully, and spoke words that he knew would break the king's heart, but which represented the only honest response to everything he had learned about the nature of existence. "King and father," he said, his voice carrying a new quality of absolute certainty, "I have a request to make of you, and I pray that you will not oppose it, for my mind is completely determined, and my resolve cannot be shaken. I wish to leave this palace and walk the path of deliverance that leads beyond all the sufferings I have witnessed. I must find the way that leads beyond aging, beyond sickness, beyond death itself, not by denying these realities, but by discovering the truth that sets the heart free, even in the midst of a world where such things are inevitable." The transformation was complete. Prince Siddhartha had become a seeker, and nothing would ever be the same again. King Shuddhodana felt his world crumble as he listened to his son's words, each syllable falling like stones into the still pond of his heart, creating ripples of pain that seemed to spread through his entire being. The very thing he had feared most, the prophecy that had haunted his dreams since Siddhartha's birth, was now unfolding before his eyes with the terrible inevitability of sunrise. His voice trembled as he responded, and those who witnessed this moment could see the struggle between a father's love and a king's authority playing out across his weathered features. "My son," the king said, tears gathering in his eyes like morning dew on flower petals, "I beg you to give up this idea that has taken hold of your mind. You are still young, barely past the spring of life, and the thoughts that come to us in youth are often like clouds that pass quickly across the sky, casting shadows that seem permanent, but soon give way to clear skies again. Our senses in the early years are eager for new experiences, and our firmest resolutions can be forgotten when we truly understand the cost and effort required to fulfill them." He paused, searching his son's face for any sign that his words were having an effect, but seeing only the quiet determination that had settled there like snow on mountain peaks. "Besides," the king continued, his voice growing more desperate, "it is a grave mistake to attempt such austere practices while the body is still young and strong. First experience the joys that youth offers, then those that come with maturity and middle age. And only then, when you have lived fully in the world and understand what you are truly leaving behind, consider retiring to the forests to become a hermit. There is time, my beloved son. There is so much time ahead of you to explore every path, to satisfy every question that troubles your mind. But Prince Siddhartha's response carried the weight of someone who had seen beyond the veils that hide life's deepest truths from ordinary perception. His voice was gentle but unshakable, like water that flows around every obstacle but never deviates from its destined course toward the sea. "Father, dear Father," he said, "if you can promise me 4 things, then I will gladly remain in your house and never speak again of seeking truth in the forests. These 4 things are all I require to stay contentedly within these palace walls." "Tell me what they are," the king said eagerly, hope flaring in his heart like a candle suddenly finding more air to feed its flame. "Whatever you ask, if it is within my power to grant, I will move heaven and earth to give it to you." Siddhartha looked at his father with eyes that held both infinite love and infinite sadness, the gaze of someone who is about to ask for the impossible, because only by asking for the impossible can they demonstrate why the possible is not enough. "Promise me, Father, that my life will never end in death. Promise me that sickness will never impair my health or the health of those I love. Promise me that age will never follow my youth, that I will never watch my body grow weak or my mind grow dim. And promise me that misfortune will never destroy the prosperity and happiness that we now enjoy, that loss will never touch our family or our kingdom." The silence that followed these words was like the hush that falls over the world just before dawn, when even the birds pause in their singing to acknowledge the profound transition taking place. King Shuddhodana understood immediately that his son was asking for the very things that no earthly power could provide, the guarantees that no father, no matter how much he loved his child, could ever offer. "You are asking too much, my son," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "These things are not mine to give, for they are not anyone's to give. What you seek lies beyond the reach of royal authority, beyond the power of any kingdom or treasure." "Then you understand why I cannot remain here," Siddhartha replied, his words carrying the finality of water reaching its lowest level. "If you cannot grant these promises, and I know in my heart that no one can, then please do not try to hold me back when I seek to find another way to deal with the realities that make life so filled with uncertainty and pain. It is not wise to act on a passing impulse, Father, but what moves me now is not impulse, but the deepest recognition of what life truly demands of us." He stood with the dignity of someone who has made a decision that aligns perfectly with his understanding of truth, and his next words carried the gravity of mountains settling into their eternal positions. "Solemn as Mount Meru is my resolve," he said, his voice resonating with quiet power. "You ask me to give up this path, but consider this carefully. When someone is trying to escape from a burning house, we should not hinder them but help them find the way to safety. The day comes inevitably when we must all leave this world, when we must all face the realities I have seen. But what merit is there in a forced separation when that time comes? How much better it is to choose a voluntary separation now, while there is still time to find the wisdom that can transform our understanding of what it means to live and die. With tears flowing down his cheeks like rivers carrying away the landscape of his hopes, King Shuddhodana watched his son turn and walk away, each step taking him further from the life they had shared and closer to a destiny that no amount of paternal love could prevent. The king returned to his chambers that night, knowing that his son's mind was made up and that all his years of protection and planning had led to this moment of inevitable loss. Siddhartha spent the evening hours walking through the great hall, where Gopa and her companions had once filled the air with laughter and music that seemed to make time itself stand still in appreciation. But now the hall was quiet, and the women who had once brought such joy to his life were sleeping deeply, their graceful forms arranged in peaceful rest throughout the spacious room. As he looked at them in the soft light that filtered through the palace windows, something profound shifted in his perception, and he saw them with eyes that had learned to see beyond surface appearances to deeper truths. Their carefully arranged beauty had given way to the natural disarray that comes with sleep. Hair that had been perfectly styled was now disheveled. Mouths that had spoken such sweet words now gaped open, and bodies that had moved with such studied grace were now sprawled in positions that spoke only of unconscious surrender to exhaustion. Their jewelry lay scattered around them, and the elegant clothes that had enhanced their loveliness were now wrinkled and twisted. In this unguarded state, they looked to Siddhartha's newly awakened perception like a preview of the dissolution that awaits every form of earthly beauty. "They are like corpses," he whispered to himself, the words rising from some deep place of recognition that he had not known existed within him. "I am standing in a place of death, surrounded by reminders that everything I have cherished is already passing away, already moving toward the dissolution that claims all temporary forms." This vision was not cruel or morbid, but rather a moment of profound awakening to the truth that beauty and youth and all the things we cling to are constantly changing, constantly flowing toward transformation whether we acknowledge this reality or not. Understanding that the time had come to act on the decision that had been forming in his heart like a pearl forming in the depths of the ocean, Siddhartha quietly left the hall and made his way toward the royal stables. His steps were sure and silent, guided by a certainty that seemed to come from beyond his ordinary mind, as if destiny itself were directing his movements. He found Chandaka, his faithful charioteer, sleeping peacefully in the quarters adjacent to the stables, and he gently woke him with the touch of someone calling a friend to share in a sacred journey. "Chandaka," he said softly, his voice carrying a quality that immediately brought the charioteer fully awake. "Bring me my horse Kanthaka at once. Tonight I ride forth to find the eternal beatitude that lies beyond all the sufferings I have witnessed, beyond all the fears that keep people trapped in cycles of anxiety and despair." Chandaka knew the king's explicit orders about keeping the prince within the palace grounds, but as he looked into Siddhartha's eyes, he felt some power greater than royal command, urging him to obey this request. It was as if the universe itself was speaking through the prince's words, making resistance not just difficult but somehow impossible. Without question or hesitation, he went to fetch Kanthaka, the magnificent horse that had carried Siddhartha on so many journeys, within the safe boundaries of the palace grounds. Kanthaka was indeed a magnificent animal, with strength that seemed almost supernatural, and a grace that made his movements appear more like dancing than mere locomotion. His coat gleamed in the moonlight like polished bronze, and his eyes held an intelligence that suggested he understood far more about the significance of this night than an ordinary horse should be able to comprehend. When Siddhartha approached him, the prince stroked the noble animal's neck with hands that trembled slightly with the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. "Many times, my noble friend," Siddhartha said, speaking to Kanthaka as he would to a trusted companion who could understand every word, "my father rode you into battle and defeated powerful enemies who threatened our kingdom and our people. Tonight, I ask you to carry me into a different kind of battle, one that will determine not just my own fate, but the fate of every being who suffers from the pain of not understanding why life contains so much difficulty and uncertainty. Today I go forth to seek the supreme enlightenment that can transform suffering into wisdom, fear into compassion, and death into a doorway to understanding rather than an ending to be dreaded. Lend me your strength, noble Kanthaka. Lend me your speed and your courage, for tonight we ride not just for my salvation, but for the salvation of all beings who struggle in the darkness of ignorance and despair." As if he understood every word and recognized the sacred nature of this mission, Kanthaka allowed Siddhartha to mount him without making any of the sounds that might have alerted the palace guards to what was happening. The horse seemed to move with supernatural quiet, his hooves touching the ground as silently as falling leaves, as if the very earth were conspiring to help the prince escape from his golden prison. Chandaka, though his heart was heavy with the knowledge that he was helping his beloved prince leave everything familiar and safe behind, climbed onto his own horse and prepared to accompany Siddhartha as far as duty and love would allow him to go. The night was clear and beautiful, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds thrown onto dark velvet by some cosmic hand that delighted in creating beauty, even in the depths of darkness. The moon hung full and bright above them, casting a silver light that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and otherworldly. As they rode quietly through the palace grounds toward the city gates, it seemed as if nature herself were blessing this journey, providing just enough light to guide their way, while maintaining the secrecy that would allow them to leave without interference. The heavy iron gates that protected Kapilavastu were designed to keep out armies, secured with bars so massive that it would normally take many strong men working together to move them even slightly. These barriers had never been opened at night without the king's explicit command, and certainly never for a single rider seeking to leave rather than enter the city. But as Siddhartha and Kanthaka approached these seemingly insurmountable obstacles, something extraordinary happened that would be remembered and spoken of for centuries to come. The gates opened silently and smoothly, as if moved by invisible hands that had been waiting centuries for exactly this moment. No guards appeared to question their departure. No alarms were raised. No challenges were issued to stop them. It was as if the entire universe had conspired to create a pathway for this prince who was willing to give up everything in search of truth, as if all the forces of destiny were aligned to ensure that nothing would prevent this journey from beginning. To find yourself, you must first lose yourself, and Siddhartha was now leaving behind every external thing that had defined his identity in order to discover who he truly was, beneath all the roles and expectations that had shaped his life. As they passed through the gates and left the city of his birth behind, Siddhartha felt no regret, no backward glance of longing for the comfort and safety he was abandoning. Instead, his heart was filled with something that felt like the deepest possible relief, as if he had been holding his breath for years and was finally able to exhale completely. He spoke to the night air with a voice that carried across the landscape like a prayer or a sacred vow. Until I have seen the end of birth and the end of death, until I have found the way beyond all suffering, I shall not return to the city of Kapila or to the life I have known there. Kanthaka carried him swiftly through the darkness, covering ground with a speed and endurance that seemed to come from some source beyond ordinary animal strength. The countryside flowed past them like a river of shadows and moonlight, and with each mile they traveled, Siddhartha felt himself moving not just through physical space, but through the landscape of his own transformation. When the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold, they found themselves near a forest where many holy hermits had made their homes among the trees. This was a place where deer slept peacefully beneath ancient trees, undisturbed by human presence because the men who lived here had learned to move through the world without causing fear or harm to any living creature. Birds fluttered about fearlessly, and the very air seemed to vibrate with a quality of peace that spoke of countless hours of meditation and prayer offered up like incense to whatever forces govern the spiritual development of human consciousness. Siddhartha looked around at this forest sanctuary and felt his heart recognize something it had been seeking without knowing what it sought. "This is the place I have been looking for," he said to Chandaka, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "Here I can begin the search that will lead me to the answers my soul requires." He dismounted from Kanthaka's back and stood for a moment with his hand on the noble animal's neck, feeling the warmth of life pulsing beneath the smooth coat, understanding that this was the last connection he would have for some time with the world of palaces and royal privilege. He looked at Chandaka with eyes that held both infinite gratitude and infinite sadness, knowing that this faithful friend, who had served him so loyally, was about to experience the pain of separation. "Truly," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "a horse possesses strength and swiftness that rival those of the gods themselves, and you, dear Chandaka, by accompanying me on this journey, have proven how great your affection and courage truly are. But now you must take Kanthaka and return to the city, for I have found the forest I was seeking, and the next part of this path I must walk alone." Chandaka's heart broke as he heard these words, for he had hoped against hope that perhaps he might be allowed to accompany his beloved prince on whatever spiritual adventure lay ahead. Tears flowed down his weathered cheeks as he realized that his role in this great story was ending, that from this moment forward, the prince he had served so faithfully would be walking a path that no loyal servant could share. But he was too well trained in duty and too aware of the sacred nature of what was happening to argue or plead for a different arrangement. Siddhartha embraced both Chandaka and Kanthaka with the tenderness of someone saying farewell to the last representatives of everything he had ever known and loved. Then, without looking back, he walked into the forest and began the next phase of his journey toward enlightenment, leaving behind not just a kingdom, but an entire way of understanding what it means to be human. The hermitage where he found himself was home to many seekers who had devoted their lives to the pursuit of spiritual truth. These were men who had given up the ordinary pleasures and pursuits that occupy most human lives in order to focus completely on the quest for liberation from suffering and ignorance. When Siddhartha appeared among them, moving with a natural grace and radiating a quality of presence that seemed to illuminate everything around him, they immediately recognized that someone extraordinary had joined their community. Wherever he went within the hermitage, it seemed as if a marvelous light preceded him, making even the simplest activities appear blessed and sacred. When he spoke, his voice was so sweet and powerful that the monks stopped whatever they were doing just to listen, and his words carried a persuasive quality that made the deepest truths seem not only understandable, but immediately applicable to daily life. It was clear that this young man who had come to them from the world of wealth and privilege possessed an inner development that far exceeded what his years should have made possible. Among the teachers in this forest community was a sage named Arata Kalama, whose understanding of meditation and spiritual discipline had attracted students from far and wide. Arata was known for his mastery of states of consciousness that most people cannot even imagine, and his reputation for wisdom and compassion had made him one of the most respected spiritual guides in the entire region. When he encountered Siddhartha and began to share his teachings with this remarkable new student, he quickly realized that he was dealing with someone whose capacity for understanding was unlike anything he had experienced in decades of teaching. Within what seemed like no time at all, Siddhartha had not only grasped the essential principles that Arata taught, but had mastered the meditative practices and reached the same level of realization that had taken his teacher many years to achieve. His progress was so rapid and so complete that Arata found himself somewhat amazed by the depth of insight this young prince displayed. One day, recognizing that his student had absorbed everything he had to offer, Arata spoke to Siddhartha with the generosity of a teacher who takes genuine joy in his student's advancement. "You understand the teachings as completely as I understand them," Arata said, his voice carrying both pride and a touch of wonder at what he had witnessed. "Everything that I know, you now know as well, and you have reached the same states of consciousness that I have spent my entire life learning to access. If you wish, we can share the work of guiding the other students in this community. We can both serve as teachers, for your realization is now equal to my own." But even as Arata spoke these generous words, Siddhartha found himself questioning whether the path he had been following was truly leading him toward the ultimate freedom he sought. He had learned to quiet his mind, to enter states of profound peace and clarity, to experience levels of consciousness that transcended ordinary awareness. Yet something within him recognized that even these remarkable achievements were not the final answer to the problem of human suffering. "Is this teaching truly the ultimate law?" he asked himself as he contemplated everything he had learned. "Does the path that Arata has shown me really lead to the complete liberation that can free all beings from the cycle of birth, aging, sickness, and death?" As he examined his experience more deeply, he began to see certain limitations in the approach he had been following. The monks in this community led lives of extraordinary austerity, refusing food prepared by human hands and eating only fruits, leaves, and roots that they could gather from the forest. They drank nothing but water, and when they slept, it was under open sky with only the branches of trees for shelter. When the sun scorched them during the day, They offered their bodies to its heat without seeking shade, and when bitter winds blew through the forest, they exposed themselves to the cold without complaint. They walked barefoot over stones that cut their feet and bruised their knees, accepting pain as a necessary part of their spiritual discipline. These practitioners believed that virtue could only be achieved through suffering, that the more they could endure, the more spiritual merit they would accumulate. They thought that by practicing perfect austerity and demonstrating complete indifference to physical comfort, they would earn the right to ascend to heavenly realms when their lives ended. In their minds, they were supremely happy because they believed their suffering was purchasing something infinitely valuable, a future existence in realms of eternal bliss. But Siddhartha, with the clarity that comes from deep meditation, combined with practical wisdom, began to see the flaws in this approach. Yes, he thought to himself, these practices may indeed lead to heavenly realms, but even the highest heavens are still part of the cycle of birth and death. To live a life of austerity while remaining indifferent to the constant reality of aging, sickness, and death for all beings is simply to add one form of suffering to another. This path may lead to temporary escape from the human condition, but it does not address the fundamental problem that keeps all conscious beings trapped in patterns of fear and pain. Every teacher teaches until they don't, then you become your own teacher. And Siddhartha had reached the point where his inner wisdom was telling him that he needed to move beyond even the most advanced teachings he had received. With great respect but firm determination, he approached Arata and spoke words that would mark another crucial turning point in his spiritual journey. "I cannot continue to teach this path alongside you," he said gently but clearly, "because I have come to understand that anyone who follows it, no matter how perfectly, will not find the complete liberation that can end suffering for all beings. I must leave this hermitage and continue searching for the approach that leads not just to personal peace, but to wisdom that can heal the fundamental pain that affects every conscious creature." And so Siddhartha left behind his first teacher and the community that had welcomed him so warmly, continuing his search for truth along paths that would lead him through even more challenging territory. He wandered until he came to the banks of a river called the Naranjana, which flowed through a landscape so beautiful it seemed designed by nature herself as the perfect setting for deep contemplation. Rich and fertile land stretched in all directions. Little villages drowsed peacefully in the shade of magnificent trees, and great meadows rolled away toward distant horizons like green carpets spread out to welcome weary travelers. "How pleasant it is here," Siddhartha thought as he surveyed this peaceful scene. "What an inviting place in which to meditate and search for the wisdom that seems to lie just beyond my current understanding. Perhaps in this beautiful setting, surrounded by the gentle rhythms of rural life and natural beauty, I will find the approach that leads to complete awakening." For 6 long years, Siddhartha remained in this area, developing practices and exploring states of consciousness that went far beyond anything he had learned from Arata Kalama or any other teacher. He never sought shelter from wind or sun or rain, allowing his body to experience every kind of weather without protection or complaint. He permitted insects to sting him and serpents to approach him without moving to defend himself, understanding that his quest for truth required him to develop a kind of equanimity that could remain peaceful even under the most challenging conditions. People from nearby villages, boys and girls, shepherds and woodcutters, would sometimes pass by and see this strange figure sitting motionless for hours or days at a time. Some jeered at him, others threw dust or mud at him in cruel amusement, but he remained oblivious to their mockery, lost in contemplation so deep that external events could not disturb his concentration. His diet became so minimal that it barely sustained life, sometimes eating only a single grain of rice per day, sometimes subsisting on nothing but a few sesame seeds for weeks at a time. The effects of this extreme asceticism on his physical body were dramatic and disturbing. He became so thin that his bones showed prominently beneath skin that seemed stretched over his frame like cloth over a framework of sticks. His ribs stood out like the bars of a cage, and his limbs grew so gaunt that they appeared almost skeletal. Yet under his emaciated forehead, his eyes continued to shine with an inner fire that spoke of consciousness, exploring territories that few human beings ever glimpse. But despite all this intense effort and extreme self-discipline, the ultimate knowledge he sought continued to elude him. The middle way is not compromise, it's wisdom, and Siddhartha was beginning to learn that truth cannot be reached through approaches that treat the body as an enemy to be conquered, rather than a temple to be honored. He realized that his extreme practices were actually weakening him to the point where clear thinking and deep meditation were becoming more difficult rather than easier. If I continue to waste away like this, he thought to himself during a moment of painful clarity, I will never reach the goal I have set for myself. How can a mind that is housed in a body weakened by starvation achieve the clarity and strength necessary for the final breakthrough to complete understanding? The body is a temple, not a prison to escape, and I must find the balance that allows both physical health and spiritual development to support each other rather than working at cross purposes. Near the place where Siddhartha had been practicing his austerities, there was a village called Uruvilva, and in this village lived 10 young women who had observed his spiritual efforts with growing concern and admiration. These women had begun bringing him small offerings of grain and fruit, leaving them nearby where he could find them if he chose to accept their charity. For months, Siddhartha had rarely touched these gifts, but now, recognizing that his approach needed to change if he was going to achieve his goal, he began to accept their offerings and slowly rebuild his strength. One day, the young women noticed that he had eaten everything they had brought him, and the next day they returned with larger portions, which he also consumed completely. Gradually, as he began to take more nourishment, they increased their offerings until he was receiving enough food to restore his health without losing the mental clarity that his years of discipline had developed. Before long, he had regained enough strength to walk to the village itself, where the inhabitants competed with each other in offering him food and hospitality. As his physical condition improved, and his natural beauty and vitality returned, it became clear that this period of extreme asceticism had not weakened his spiritual development, but had somehow refined and purified it in ways that were now allowing him to access even deeper levels of understanding. When we stop fighting life, life stops fighting us, and Siddhartha was learning to work with his human nature rather than against it in his quest for ultimate truth. One night, as he slept peacefully in a place where his mind had found the perfect balance between effort and ease, between discipline and compassion. Siddhartha experienced 5 dreams that would prove to be prophetic indicators that his long search was approaching its climax. These dreams came to him with a vividness and symbolic clarity that left no doubt about their significance. In the first dream, he saw himself lying on a bed that was the entire earth, with the Himalaya mountains serving as his pillow. His right hand rested on the Western Ocean, his left hand on the Eastern Ocean, and his feet touched the Southern Sea. This dream spoke of consciousness expanding to embrace the entire world, of awareness becoming so vast that it could encompass all of existence within its understanding. In the second dream, he saw a reed growing from his navel, shooting upward so rapidly that it soon reached the sky itself. This image represented the spiritual axis that connects earth to heaven, the pathway along which consciousness can ascend from ordinary awareness to the highest possible realization. The third dream showed him covered with worms that crawled up his legs and completely enveloped his body, yet when he looked more carefully, these creatures transformed into seekers and students who were approaching him for guidance and teaching. This vision indicated that he would soon become a teacher whose wisdom would attract countless beings seeking liberation from their own suffering. In the fourth dream, birds flew toward him from every direction, north, south, east, and west. And as they approached his head, they seemed to turn from ordinary creatures into beings of pure gold. This symbolized the way that all forms of seeking, from every possible direction and tradition, would be transformed into wisdom when they encountered the truth he was about to discover. The fifth and final dream was perhaps the most significant of all. He saw himself standing at the foot of an enormous mountain made entirely of filth and excrement, a sight that would normally provoke disgust and revulsion in any observer. But in the dream, he climbed this mountain with perfect equanimity, reached its summit, and then descended the other side without being defiled in any way by what he had encountered. This powerful image represented his readiness to face every form of human suffering and ignorance without being overwhelmed or contaminated by it. His ability to move through even the most challenging aspects of existence while maintaining perfect purity of heart and mind. When Siddhartha awakened from these dreams, he knew with absolute certainty that the day had arrived when he would attain the supreme knowledge that had been the goal of all his seeking. The long years of preparation, his sheltered youth, his shocking encounters with aging, sickness, and death, his departure from palace life, his studies with various teachers, his extreme ascetic practices, and his discovery of the middle way, all of this had been leading to this moment when he would finally break through to complete understanding. He rose from his resting place and set out for the village of Aurovilva, knowing that he needed to receive one final meal before undertaking the meditation that would transform him from a seeker into one who had found what every conscious being seeks. Among the 10 young women who had been caring for him, there was one named Sujata, whose devotion and spiritual sensitivity had made her particularly attuned to the sacred nature of what was happening. That morning, Sujata had been milking her 8 wonderful cows, animals whose milk was remarkably rich and flavorful, possessing qualities that seemed almost supernatural in their nourishing power. As she prepared to make an offering of rice cooked in this exceptional milk, adding honey for sweetness and love for flavor, something extraordinary happened that confirmed her intuition about the significance of this day. When she set the mixture to boil in a new pot placed on a new stove, huge bubbles began to form and float gracefully off to the right, without causing the liquid to rise or spill even a single drop. The stove produced no smoke despite the intensity of the fire beneath it, and the entire cooking process seemed to be guided by forces beyond ordinary natural laws. Sujata was filled with amazement and called to her servant Purna, "The gods themselves are blessing our efforts today. Go quickly and see if the holy man is approaching our house, for I believe this miraculous cooking is a sign that something sacred is about to happen." Purna hurried to the doorway and looked out toward the path that led to their village. There she saw Siddhartha walking toward them, but he appeared transformed from the emaciated ascetic they had been caring for. He was now radiating a light so brilliant and golden that she could barely look directly at him. She ran back to Sujata, her voice trembling with awe. "He is coming, mistress, he is coming." But be prepared to be overwhelmed by his splendor, for he shines like the sun itself. "Let him come, oh let him come," Sujata cried, her heart overflowing with joy and reverence. This wonderful milk was prepared especially for him, and I understand now that this day has been chosen by destiny itself for something that will change the world. When Siddhartha arrived at her house, his very presence seemed to illuminate everything around him with a radiance that spoke of approaching enlightenment. Sujata approached him with the deepest respect, bowing 7 times before offering him a golden bowl filled with the miraculous rice milk that had been prepared under such auspicious circumstances. As he accepted this final meal before his great awakening, Siddhartha understood that he was receiving much more than physical nourishment. He was being given a blessing that would sustain him through the ultimate confrontation with everything that keeps beings trapped in cycles of fear and suffering. All Buddhas throughout history, he thought as he held the golden bowl in his hands, have received their final meal before enlightenment served to them in a golden vessel just like this one. Since Sujata offers me this gift at exactly the right moment and in exactly the right way, I know that the time has truly come for me to fulfill the destiny that has been guiding my entire life. He drank the nourishing mixture slowly and gratefully, feeling strength flow through his body and clarity sharpen in his mind, preparing him for the meditation that would finally reveal the truth that sets all beings free from the suffering that seems so fundamental to existence. The stage was set, the preparation was complete, and the moment that all of human history had been waiting for was about to begin. As the day reached its peaceful conclusion, and Siddhartha felt the nourishment of Sujata's gift flowing through his body, he began walking slowly along the banks of the Naranjana River toward a destination that seemed to be calling to him from across the landscape of destiny itself. The evening light was soft and golden, painting everything it touched with the kind of luminous beauty that makes ordinary moments feel sacred. Sweet fragrance rose from the fields and gardens that bordered the river, and birds were offering their gentle evening songs to the approaching twilight, as if all of nature were preparing to witness something that would change the course of human consciousness forever. As he walked, Siddhartha noticed that the road beneath his feet was being transformed by some mysterious force into something that seemed more like a pathway through paradise than an ordinary earthly route. Gold dust appeared to be sprinkled across the ground where his feet would step, creating a trail that sparkled in the fading sunlight like stars scattered across dark earth. Rare palm trees lined the way, their trunks appearing to be encrusted with precious stones that caught and reflected the light in patterns that seemed almost alive with inner fire. It was as if the universe itself were rolling out a royal carpet for someone approaching the most important appointment in the history of human spiritual development. The path led him past a pool whose blessed waters exhaled a fragrance so intoxicating that simply breathing the air around it seemed to induce a state of peaceful meditation. White, yellow, blue, and red lotuses spread their massive petals across the surface of this sacred pond, and the clear songs of swans filled the air with music that seemed to come from celestial realms rather than from ordinary earthly creatures. Everything about this landscape spoke of a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds had become so thin that they were beginning to merge into a single reality. Then, rising before him like a natural cathedral, designed by the hand of creation itself, Siddhartha saw the tree that had been waiting for him through countless ages of preparation and seeking. The Bodhi tree stood with a presence that was both utterly natural and completely supernatural, its branches spreading wide to create a canopy that seemed to embrace the entire world in its protective shade. This was not just a tree, but a living symbol of the connection between earth and heaven, its roots reaching deep into the soil of ordinary reality while its branches stretched upward toward whatever lies beyond the visible sky. Siddhartha approached this sacred place with steps that carried him not just across physical ground, but across the threshold between his old life as a seeker and his destiny as one who would find what every conscious being seeks. He walked to the eastern side of the tree and bowed 7 times, acknowledging the sacred nature of what was about to take place and offering his respect to all the forces that had guided him to this moment. Then he took several handfuls of grass that grew nearby and scattered them on the ground beneath the tree's protective branches. Suddenly, as if materialized by the sheer power of his intention and the readiness of the moment, a great seat appeared where the grass had been scattered. Soft grass covered it like the finest carpet, creating a natural throne that seemed designed specifically for the meditation that would transform not just one man's understanding, but the spiritual possibilities available to every being who has ever struggled with the mystery, existence. This was the seat where suffering would finally be understood, where the questions that have haunted human consciousness since the beginning of time would finally find their answers. Siddhartha settled himself upon this seat with the kind of graceful determination that comes from knowing beyond any doubt that you are exactly where you need to be, exactly when you need to be there. He held his head and shoulders erect with the dignity of someone who has nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and he turned his face toward the east, toward the direction from which dawn comes to awaken the world from the darkness of night. In that moment, feeling the solid earth beneath him and the vast sky above him, he spoke words that would echo through eternity as an example of what complete commitment to truth looks like. "Even if my skin should parch and crack under the heat of the sun," he said, his voice carrying across the grove with the authority of absolute resolve, Even if my hands should wither and lose all their strength, even if my bones should crumble into dust and scatter on the wind, I will not move from this seat until I have attained the supreme knowledge that can free all beings from the suffering that seems so fundamental to existence. Then he crossed his legs in the meditation posture that would support him through whatever internal battles lay ahead, and he settled into a stillness that was deeper than the peace of mountains, more unshakable than the resolve of rivers flowing toward the sea. The light that emanated from Siddhartha's body as he entered into this final meditation was so brilliant that it penetrated even to those realms where Mara, the personification of everything that keeps beings trapped in cycles of fear and desire, held dominion over the forces of distraction and delusion. This radiance was not ordinary light, but the luminosity of consciousness approaching its full awakening, and it dazzled Mara like lightning piercing through the deepest darkness. As this light reached the shadowy kingdom where doubt and temptation reign supreme, Mara seemed to hear a voice speaking words that filled him with apprehension and dread. The one who renounced a kingdom is now seated beneath the tree of knowledge, the voice proclaimed with the certainty of prophecy being fulfilled. He is concentrating his mind with the kind of focus that can penetrate through every illusion, and he is making the supreme effort that will soon bring to all creatures the help they have been seeking through countless lifetimes of struggle and confusion. Because of what he is about to accomplish, the realm of awakened beings will be filled to overflowing, and the kingdom of ignorance and fear will be emptied of its subjects. You, Mara, will find yourself a commander without an army, a king without subjects, and you will not know where to take refuge when truth finally illuminates every corner of existence. Mara was filled with the kind of panic that comes to those who have built their power on illusion when they realize that reality is about to expose their kingdom as nothing more than shadows and dreams. He tried to sleep, hoping to escape into unconsciousness, the growing certainty that his dominion over human consciousness was about to end. But his slumber was disturbed by terrible nightmares that showed him exactly what was approaching. He saw his palace of delusion crumbling into dust, his armies of distraction fleeing in terror, and his own power dissolving like mist before the rising sun of awakened understanding. When he could no longer bear the visions that plagued his sleep, Mara awakened and immediately summoned his servants and soldiers, the personifications of every form of mental suffering that has ever plagued human consciousness. When these beings saw their master, they became alarmed by his appearance, for he looked pale and shaken, his confidence replaced by an anxiety that made his entire being tremble with apprehension. Sartavaha, one of his sons who represented the pride that keeps beings trapped in cycles of comparison and competition, approached his father with concern. "Father," Sartavaha said, his voice carrying the worry of someone who sees his leader's strength wavering, "you look disturbed and unhappy. Your heart beats with a rhythm that speaks of fear, and your limbs shake as if you have seen something that has shattered your usual confidence. What have you heard? What have you witnessed that has affected you so deeply? Speak to us, for we have never seen you in such a state of distress." Mara's reply came in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of inevitable defeat, the tone of someone who has suddenly understood that the game he has been playing is about to end with his complete loss. "My sons," he said, his words heavy with the knowledge of approaching transformation. The days of my pride and power are numbered. I heard a voice crying out through the light that emanates from the one who sits beneath the tree of knowledge. And this voice told me that his awakening will mark the end of everything I have built through ages of keeping beings trapped in ignorance and fear. I have had dreams so terrible that they seem to strip away every illusion I have ever created about my own permanence and authority. He paused, his gaze turning inward, as if he were seeing again the visions that had tormented his sleep. I saw a black cloud of dust settling over my palace, covering everything I have constructed with the darkness of approaching dissolution. All of you, my faithful servants, had deserted me and fled to places where my authority could no longer reach you. When I tried to draw my sword to fight against the light that threatened to expose all my deceptions, I found that the weapon would not come free from its scabbard, as if even my tools of battle had abandoned me in this crucial hour. My subjects fled in horror from my presence, and impenetrable darkness closed in around me until I heard the sound of my own palace crashing to the ground like thunder, announcing the end of an age. Satavaha, though disturbed by his father's account, tried to offer counsel that might restore some measure of confidence to their cause. "Father," he said, "it is indeed disheartening to lose a battle before it has even been fought. If you have seen omens that suggest defeat, perhaps it would be wiser to avoid this confrontation altogether, rather than risk the inglorious destruction that your dreams have shown you." But Mara, despite his fears, was not ready to surrender without making at least an attempt to preserve the kingdom of delusion that he had ruled for so long. He refused to listen to his son's cautious advice, and instead ordered his entire army to advance against the one who threatened to bring light into every corner where ignorance and suffering had previously reigned, unchallenged. What you resist persists. What you accept transforms. But Mara had not yet learned this fundamental truth, and so he chose to fight rather than face the reality of what was happening beneath the Bodhi tree. The army that assembled at Mara's command was a fearsome sight that represented every form of mental torment that conscious beings can experience. It bristled with weapons of distraction and delusion, pikes of piercing doubt, arrows of self-criticism, swords of comparison that cut the heart, enormous battle axes of despair, and heavy clubs of confusion that could bludgeon even the strongest mind into submission. The soldiers themselves were manifestations of every kind of psychological suffering imaginable, their appearance designed to inspire terror in anyone who looked upon them. Some were black as the darkest depression, others blue as the coldest loneliness, still others yellow as the sickliest anxiety, or red as the most violent anger. Their faces were terrifying beyond description, their eyes cruel flames that burned with the intensity of uncontrolled passion, and their mouths spewed blood that represented all the harm that beings do to themselves and others when they are lost in the darkness of unconscious reactivity. Many had multiple heads representing the endless multiplication of worries that can plague a restless mind, while others had numerous arms symbolizing the frantic grasping that keeps people trapped in cycles of wanting and disappointment. Instead of ornaments, they wore necklaces made from bones and dried human fingers, gruesome decorations that spoke of all the ways that unconscious living leads to spiritual death and the gradual destruction of everything beautiful and alive in human nature. They advanced toward the Bodhi tree, with hideous laughter and savage cries that were designed to shatter the concentration of anyone who dared to seek truth in the face of such overwhelming opposition. This was the full force of every psychological obstacle that has ever prevented a human being from discovering their true nature and living in the freedom that comes from understanding reality as it actually is. Before launching his direct assault, Mara attempted to frighten Siddhartha by demonstrating the terrifying power he could unleash against anyone who dared to challenge his authority. He roused the fury of the winds, sending cyclones rushing toward the meditation seat from every direction, storms so violent that they uprooted ancient trees, devastated entire villages, and shook mountains until boulders tumbled from their peaks, like teardrops falling from the eyes of giants. These winds were meant to represent the way that life's unexpected changes can overwhelm us when we try to hold on to things that are constantly shifting and transforming. But Siddhartha, seated in perfect stillness beneath the Bodhi tree, never moved so much as a finger in response to this supernatural storm. Not a single fold of his robe was disturbed by winds that were destroying everything else in their path, for he had learned the secret of finding the eye of the hurricane, that place of perfect peace that exists at the center of every disturbance. You are not your thoughts, you are the awareness watching them, and Siddhartha had discovered the part of himself that could remain completely unaffected by even the most violent external circumstances. Seeing that wind could not shake this seeker's determination, Mara summoned torrential rains that fell with such violence they seemed capable of submerging entire cities and scarring the very surface of the earth with their intensity. These floods represented the way that overwhelming emotions can seem to drown our peace and wash away every trace of the stability we have worked so hard to build in our lives. But once again, Siddhartha remained completely unmoved, and not a single thread of his clothing became wet, as if he existed in a space that was somehow beyond the reach of any external force, no matter how powerful. Next, Mara hurled blazing rocks through the air, meteors that glowed with the heat of 1,000 fires, and sped toward their target with the force of cosmic destruction. These burning projectiles symbolized the way that life sometimes seems to bombard us with painful experiences that feel like attacks from an unjust universe. But as these flaming stones approached the tree where Siddhartha sat in meditation, something miraculous happened that demonstrated the power of complete non-resistance to transform even the most threatening circumstances. The rocks changed in mid-flight, their fire extinguished and their hardness transformed, so that they fell not as weapons but as flowers, gently scattering around the meditation seat, like offerings from a grateful cosmos. Frustrated by the failure of his elemental attacks, Mara commanded his army to loose their arrows directly at the figure who seemed immune to every form of assault they could devise. Thousands of projectiles filled the air, arrows of self-doubt, spears of regret, javelins of fear about the future, and darts of criticism that were designed to pierce the heart of anyone who dared to believe they were worthy of genuine happiness and peace. But every single one of these weapons underwent the same transformation as the burning stones, changing from instruments of destruction into beautiful flowers that created a fragrant carpet around the base of the Bodhi tree. Finally, in desperation, the entire army rushed forward in a massive assault, intending to overwhelm through sheer numbers what they could not defeat through any individual attack. But the light that emanated from Siddhartha's concentrated awareness acted as an impenetrable shield, protecting him not through resistance, but through a kind of presence so complete that negativity simply could not maintain its coherence in the face of such unconditional acceptance. Swords were shattered when they encountered this radiance, battle axes were bent beyond repair, and every weapon that fell to the ground was immediately transformed into yet another flower, until the entire battlefield became a garden more beautiful than any earthly paradise. Suddenly, filled with terror at witnessing these incredible transformations, the soldiers of fear and delusion began to flee in every direction, abandoning their weapons and running like children who have finally seen through the illusions that had seemed so threatening in the darkness. Mara found himself alone on the battlefield, wringing his hands in anguish as he realized that everything he had depended upon to maintain his power over human consciousness had proved completely ineffective against the simple presence of someone who had learned to stop fighting. Reality. "What have I done wrong?" Mara cried out in his frustration and confusion. "How is it possible that this one person can defeat everything I am capable of sending against him? I have been generous to those who served me. I have granted desires to countless beings who asked for my help, and those who are fleeing could bear witness to my kindness and the rewards I have given them for their loyalty." The retreating troops, still within hearing distance, called back to their defeated commander, "Yes, you have been kind and generous to us, and we will bear witness to your gifts and favors." But their voices carried a note of finality, as if they were already recognizing that their old loyalties belonged to a world that was passing away. Mara, clutching at this fading support, turned his attention back to Siddhartha and spoke with the voice of someone making a last desperate argument. "But what proof has this man given of his own generosity?" he demanded. "What sacrifices has he made that entitle him to claim victory over powers that have ruled human consciousness since the beginning of time? Who will bear witness to his qualifications for the awakening he seeks to achieve? Where are the supporters who can testify to his worthiness?" In that moment, a voice arose from the earth itself, speaking with the authority of the foundation that supports all life and has witnessed every act of compassion and sacrifice throughout the history of conscious existence. "I will bear witness to his generosity," the earth declared, her voice carrying the weight of geological ages and the wisdom of countless seasons of growth and renewal. This was the moment when truth needed no defense, when reality itself spoke on behalf of someone who had aligned his entire life with the deepest principles of love and service. The earth continued speaking, her words flowing like a river carrying the accumulated wisdom of all time. "Yes, I, who am the mother of all beings, will gladly bear witness to his boundless generosity. 100 times, 1,000 times, in the course of his previous existences, this being has offered his hands, his eyes, his head, his entire body in service of others who were suffering or in need. In this current lifetime, which will be his last before complete liberation, he will destroy the very roots of aging, sickness, and death for all who encounter his teaching. As surely as he excels you in spiritual strength, Mara, he surpasses you equally in the generosity that flows from a heart that has learned to love without conditions or limitations." As the earth spoke these words of testimony, Mara saw a woman of extraordinary beauty emerge from the ground up to her waist, rising like a flower blooming from the soil of truth itself. She bowed before Siddhartha with hands clasped in reverence, and her voice joined the earth's in bearing witness. O most holy of beings, I too testify to your boundless generosity and your worthiness to achieve the supreme awakening that will benefit every conscious creature. Then she disappeared back into the ground, leaving Mara alone with the devastating recognition that he had been completely defeated by someone who had never raised a weapon against him, never returned attack with attack, but had simply remained present in the face of everything that fear and confusion could devise. Mara wept then, not the tears of physical pain, but the deeper sorrow of an illusion finally seeing through itself, the grief of delusion, recognizing its own emptiness when confronted with genuine truth. His defeat was not just a personal loss, but the end of an entire era in human consciousness, the beginning of a time when beings would have access to wisdom that could free them from the cycles of suffering that had seemed so inescapable. By sunset, the entire army of psychological obstacles had fled, and nothing remained to disturb Siddhartha's meditation as he entered the final phase of his journey toward complete awakening. Throughout the first watch of the night, as darkness settled over the world, like a gentle blanket, preparing consciousness for the rest that makes transformation possible, Siddhartha's awareness began to expand in ways that revealed the true nature of existence across time and space. He gained the ability to perceive his own previous lives, not as stories he had heard, but as direct memories of countless existences in which he had been born, had grown and learned and loved, had aged and died, only to be born again in an endless cycle of experience and development. This knowledge came to him with perfect clarity, showing him how consciousness moves through form after form, each lifetime offering new opportunities for growth and understanding, each death simply a doorway to new possibilities for learning and service. He saw himself in countless bodies, in every kind of circumstance that conscious beings can experience, sometimes wealthy and sometimes poor, sometimes healthy and sometimes sick, sometimes surrounded by love, and sometimes walking through loneliness that seemed to stretch for lifetimes. But through all these varied experiences, he could see the thread of growing wisdom that connected each existence to the next, the way that every joy and every sorrow had contributed to the development of the compassion and understanding that had brought him to this moment beneath the Bodhi tree. The only way out is through, and he could see how his consciousness had been moving through every possible human experience in preparation for the breakthrough that was now approaching. During the second watch of the night, as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns and the world slept peacefully around him, Siddhartha's perception expanded even further to encompass the present state of all beings throughout the universe. He could see with perfect clarity how every conscious creature was experiencing the results of their own actions and choices, how each being was creating their own experience through the way they responded to the circumstances that arose in their lives. This was not a vision of judgment or punishment, but a clear understanding of how consciousness shapes its own reality through the patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting that it chooses to cultivate. He saw beings trapped in cycles of anger, creating more situations that would trigger their anger, creatures caught in patterns of fear, drawing to themselves more experiences that would confirm their fears, and souls lost in confusion, generating more circumstances that would perpetuate their confusion. But he also saw the infinite possibility for transformation that existed in every moment, the way that any being could step out of destructive patterns simply by learning to respond differently to whatever life presented to them. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but presence in the midst of it, and he could see how every challenge contained within itself the seeds of the wisdom needed to transcend it. In the third watch of the night, as dawn began to prepare its entrance from beyond the eastern horizon, Siddhartha's understanding penetrated to the very heart of existence itself, revealing the chain of causes and effects that keeps all beings bound in cycles of suffering, and the way that this chain can be broken through genuine wisdom. In profound meditation that seemed to encompass all of time and space within its scope, he spoke to himself the words that would become the foundation of teaching that would transform human understanding for all future generations. Miserable indeed is this world that is born, grows old and dies, then is reborn only to grow old and die again, he said, his inner voice carrying the weight of complete understanding. And human beings know no way out of this cycle because they have not understood its true cause. But now I see clearly that ignorance is the root of death, of old age, of suffering, and of despair. To exist in unconsciousness is to suffer, because desire that arises from not understanding our true nature leads from birth to rebirth, from suffering to further suffering, in an endless cycle that can only be broken through awakening to what we really are. The understanding that flowed through his consciousness was both incredibly simple and infinitely profound. By ending ignorance, we prevent the birth of unconscious desire. By stifling craving that comes from not knowing our true nature, we prevent the rebirth of suffering patterns. By leading a life of complete awareness and compassion, desire is transformed from a source of bondage into a force for awakening, and we cease to create the very suffering we have been trying so desperately to escape. When the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to celebrate the transformation that had taken place during the night, Siddhartha had become something entirely new in human history. He was no longer a seeker, but one who had found, no longer someone struggling with questions, but someone who had discovered answers so complete they could satisfy every genuine inquiry about the nature of existence and the possibility of freedom from suffering. He had become a Buddha, one who is fully awakened to the truth that sets all beings free. From the depths of his being, words arose that proclaimed the end of his long search and the beginning of a new chapter in human spiritual development. I have had numerous births in the cycle of existence, he declared, his voice carrying across the grove with the authority of complete realization. In vain have I sought through lifetime after lifetime the builder of the house of suffering that seemed so solid and permanent. Oh, what torment there is in this endless cycle of birth and death and rebirth, this constant repetition of the same patterns of pain and confusion. But I have seen you at last, O builder of the house of illusion, he continued, his words ringing with the joy of one who has finally solved the greatest mystery of existence. You will build this house of suffering no longer, for I have broken through the illusion that gave you power over consciousness. The rafters of delusion are broken, the walls of separation have crumbled, and the entire structure of unconscious living has collapsed into the recognition of what was always already true. The mind has attained nirvana, the peace that comes from no longer fighting reality, and birth into unconsciousness is no more because the desire that creates suffering has been transformed into the wisdom that creates freedom. At the moment of this ultimate realization, the entire earth trembled 12 times, not with the violence of destruction, but with the gentle shaking of a mother's laughter, as she witnesses her child taking the first steps that will carry him into a life of limitless possibility. The world itself seemed to blossom like a great flower opening to receive the light of a sun that had never shone before, and every conscious being, whether they understood what was happening or not, felt something shift in the very fabric of existence that made new forms of peace and happiness available for the first time. Throughout the cosmos, gods and celestial beings, who had been waiting through countless ages for this moment, burst into songs of celebration that echoed through every realm of existence. "He has come," they sang, their voices blending into a harmony that seemed to heal every discord that had ever existed. "He who brings light into the world has finally appeared." The eye of the world, so long blinded by ignorance and fear, has opened at last, and this eye is dazzled by the light of truth that can illuminate every corner where darkness once seemed permanent and unchangeable. "O conqueror of suffering," the divine voices continued, "you will give to all beings that which they have been seeking through every prayer, every effort, every hope that has ever risen from a heart longing for genuine peace and understanding. Guided by the sublime light of the wisdom you have discovered, all creatures will be able to reach the shores of deliverance from the ocean of pain that has seemed so vast and impossible to cross. You hold the lamp that can dispel every form of darkness. Go now and share this light with all who are ready to receive it." The Buddha, for that is what Siddhartha had become, the word meaning one who has awakened, sat in perfect stillness as the full implications of his realization settled into every cell of his being. The Buddha you seek is the Buddha you are, and he had discovered that what he had been searching for through years of seeking had always been his own true nature, waiting to be recognized beneath all the layers of conditioning and confusion that had hidden it from view. He had not gained anything new, but had simply stopped believing in the illusions that had made his inherent freedom seem so distant and difficult to achieve. The long night of seeking was over, and the eternal day of awakened living had begun. From this moment forward, every word he spoke would carry the power to awaken others to their own Buddha nature. Every teaching he offered would be a bridge, allowing beings to cross from the shore of suffering to the shore of lasting peace. And every person who encountered him would have the opportunity to discover for themselves the truth that sets consciousness free from every form of bondage and limitation. The battle with Mara had ended not in victory over an external enemy, but in the recognition that there had never been an enemy at all, only the opportunity to learn that what you resist persists, while what you accept with complete understanding transforms into wisdom and compassion. The army of mental obstacles had fled, not because they were defeated, but because they were revealed to be nothing more than temporary appearances in consciousness, no more real or permanent than clouds passing across the face of an eternal sun. As the sun rose fully above the horizon, casting its light across a world that was now blessed with the presence of a fully awakened being, the Buddha remained in meditation, integrating the profound transformation that had occurred and preparing to share with all beings the good news that suffering is not the inevitable condition of existence, but simply a case of mistaken identity that can be corrected through the application of wisdom and compassion to every moment of living. The great work was complete, and the greater work of teaching was about to begin. For 7 days after his awakening, the Buddha remained seated beneath the Bodhi tree in a state of perfect peace that seemed to encompass not just his own being, but the entire universe around him. He was like someone who has been carrying a heavy burden for countless miles and has finally been able to set it down, discovering in that moment of release a lightness and freedom that feels almost too wonderful to believe. The suffering that had driven his entire spiritual quest had not just ended, but had been revealed to be based on a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of existence itself. Now, sitting in the afterglow of complete realization, he found himself facing a question that would determine the course of human spiritual development for all future generations. The wisdom he had discovered was so profound, so different from the way most people understand life, that he began to wonder whether anyone would be able to comprehend what he had learned. "This truth I have found," he thought to himself as he contemplated the vastness of what had been revealed to him, "is deep beyond measure, subtle beyond ordinary thinking, and peaceful beyond anything most beings have ever imagined possible. It cannot be grasped by logic alone or understood through intellectual analysis, for it transcends the very categories of thought that people normally use to make sense of their experience." He reflected on how his awakening had come not through gaining something new, but through releasing everything unnecessary, not through building up complex philosophical systems, but through seeing through the illusions that had made simple truth seem so complicated. "How can I explain to others that what they seek is what they already are?" he wondered. "How can I help them understand that the peace they long for is not something to be achieved, but something to be uncovered beneath all the mental activity that keeps them feeling separate from their own deepest nature?" The more he contemplated the challenge of teaching, the more daunting it seemed. Most people, he realized, were so caught up in the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain that they had little interest in questioning the fundamental assumptions that kept them trapped in cycles of wanting and disappointment. They were like people who had become so accustomed to wearing heavy chains that they no longer noticed the weight, and if someone suggested they could remove these burdens, they might well respond with suspicion or disbelief. "If I teach this truth," the Buddha thought, "who will be ready to hear it without distorting it into something that fits their existing beliefs and desires?" For a moment, the compassionate heart that had motivated his entire spiritual journey seemed to waver in the face of this enormous challenge. Perhaps, he considered, it would be better to remain silent, to enjoy the peace I have found, without trying to share it with those who may not be ready to receive it. Why risk having this pure wisdom misunderstood or corrupted by those who would try to turn it into another system of beliefs to argue about, or another set of practices to perform mechanically? But even as these thoughts of hesitation arose in his mind, something deeper began to stir in his heart, the very compassion that had originally motivated him to seek a solution to the problem of human suffering. He remembered all the beings he had encountered, who were struggling with the same pain and confusion that had once driven him from his palace. All the people who were seeking peace, but looking for it in places where it could never be found. How could he keep to himself the understanding that could free them from unnecessary suffering when their need was so great and their searching so sincere? As he sat in meditation, contemplating this dilemma, with the clarity that comes from a mind that has been completely purified of self-centered concerns, the Buddha began to see that there were indeed beings in the world who would be ready to understand his teaching. Like lotus flowers growing in a pond, he realized, human consciousness exists at many different stages of development. Some people were like lotuses still buried deep in the mud of ignorance and confusion, not yet ready to respond to the light of wisdom, even when it shines directly upon them. Others were like buds that had risen partway through the water, beginning to sense the possibility of something greater, but not yet ready to open fully to the truth of their own nature. But there were also those whose consciousness was like lotuses that had reached the surface of the water and were ready to bloom the moment the first rays of sunrise touched their petals. These were beings who had already done much of the inner work necessary for awakening, who had already begun to question the assumptions that keep most people trapped in cycles of seeking and disappointment. For these ready souls, even a few words of genuine wisdom might be enough to trigger the recognition of their own Buddha nature, the realization that what they had been seeking through so much effort and struggle was actually their own deepest essence. Out of compassion for all beings, the Buddha finally decided, I will teach this path to freedom. Even if only a few are ready to understand completely, those few can become lights that help illuminate the way for others who are still finding their path through the darkness of confusion and fear. And for those who are not yet ready for the deepest teachings, perhaps I can offer simpler instructions that will help them move in the direction of greater peace and understanding, preparing them for the fuller realization that may come in this lifetime or in future ones. Having made this momentous decision to share his wisdom with the world, the Buddha rose from his meditation seat beneath the Bodhi tree and began to consider where he should offer his first teaching. His mind immediately turned to the 5 ascetics who had been his companions during the years when he was practicing extreme austerities by the banks of the Naranjana River. These men had left him when he abandoned those harsh practices in favor of the middle way, disappointed that he had given up what they considered the most direct path to liberation. But the Buddha could see with his awakened perception that these sincere seekers would be ready to understand that his apparent abandonment of spiritual discipline had actually led him to a far more effective approach to the ending of suffering. He set out on foot towards Sarnath, the place where these 5 ascetics had established their own community of practice, walking with the unhurried pace of someone who has nowhere to go because he has arrived at his true destination. As he traveled, people who encountered him along the way were struck by something extraordinary about his presence, though most could not put into words what made him seem so different from every other wandering holy man they had ever met. There was a quality of complete peace about him that seemed to emanate from every gesture, every glance, every word he spoke to those who greeted him along the road. When he finally reached the place where the 5 ascetics were living, they saw him approaching from a distance and made a pact among themselves not to show him the usual courtesies they would offer to a respected teacher. "This is Gautama," they said to each other, "who gave up the holy life and turned to luxury and comfort when the path became difficult. We should not stand to greet him or offer him a seat or show him any of the respect due to someone who has maintained his spiritual discipline." But as the Buddha drew nearer, something about his presence began to affect them in ways they had not anticipated. Almost without realizing what they were doing, they found themselves rising to their feet, preparing a seat for him, and offering him water to wash his feet and refresh himself after his journey. There was something about the quality of peace that surrounded him that made such gestures feel not just appropriate, but absolutely necessary, as if they were in the presence of someone who had discovered something precious beyond all ordinary understanding. Even though they offered him these courtesies, they still addressed him by his personal name, rather than using the titles of respect they would normally employ when speaking to a spiritual teacher. "Welcome, Gautama," they said, their voices carrying a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "We hope your journey has been pleasant, and that you have found whatever you were seeking when you left our community." The Buddha looked at them with eyes that held infinite compassion and a gentle humor that comes from seeing clearly through all the illusions that cause beings to suffer unnecessarily. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying a quality that immediately captured their complete attention, "do not address me by my personal name, as you might speak to an equal or a friend. I have become a Tathagata, one who has found the way beyond all suffering, and I have come to share with you the wheel of teaching that can lead all beings to the same freedom I have discovered." At first, the 5 ascetics were inclined to dismiss this claim as the boastful talk of someone who had compromised his spiritual practice and was now trying to justify his lack of discipline. "How can you, who gave up the effort and returned to a life of ease, claim to have achieved what we who have maintained our austerities have not yet reached?" they asked. But something in the Buddha's presence made it impossible for them to maintain their skepticism for long. There was an authority in his words that came not from intellectual knowledge, but from direct realization, and a peace in his being that spoke of someone who had indeed found what every spiritual seeker hopes to discover. Over the course of several days, the Buddha shared with these 5 men the essential insights that had led to his awakening, speaking in language so simple and clear that even the most profound truths became immediately accessible to their understanding. He taught them what would become known as the 4 Noble Truths, 4 observations about existence that cut through all the complexity and confusion that usually surrounds discussions of human suffering and its resolution. The first truth, he explained, is that life as most people experience, it contains a fundamental dissatisfaction that arises from not understanding the nature of reality. This is not pessimism, but simple recognition of the obvious fact that even our happiest moments are temporary, that everything we love will eventually change, and that we spend much of our time fighting against circumstances we cannot control. The teaching is simple: stop fighting reality, and half of your suffering ends immediately. The second truth, he continued, is that this suffering has a cause, and that cause is our constant craving for life, to be different from what it is. We suffer not because difficult things happen, but because we resist difficult things when they arise, and cling to pleasant things, when they begin to change. This craving keeps us trapped in cycles of wanting and disappointment because it is based on the illusion that our happiness depends on external circumstances rather than on our understanding of our own true nature. The third truth, the Buddha explained with the joy of someone sharing the most wonderful possible news, is that this suffering can completely end. It is not a permanent condition that we must simply endure, but a case of mistaken identity that can be corrected through wisdom and compassion. When we stop believing that we are separate from life and start recognizing that we are life itself expressing through a temporary form, the very foundation of suffering dissolves into the peace that was always our true nature. And the fourth truth, he concluded, is that there is a practical path that leads to this freedom, not a complicated system of beliefs or practices that takes lifetimes to master, but a simple way of living that anyone can begin to apply immediately. This is the Eightfold Path, which is really just 8 different ways of describing what it means to live with complete honesty, compassion, and awareness in every moment. The Eightfold Path that the Buddha taught was not a series of rules to follow mechanically, but a description of how life naturally expresses itself when we stop fighting against our own deepest wisdom. Right understanding means seeing clearly what is actually happening, rather than what we wish were happening or fear might happen. Right intention means allowing our actions to flow from compassion rather than from selfish grasping or unconscious reactivity. Right speech means speaking truthfully and kindly, using words that heal rather than harm. Right action means behaving in ways that honor the interconnectedness of all life, rather than trying to gain advantage at others' expense. Right livelihood means finding ways to support ourselves that do not cause unnecessary suffering to other beings. Right effort means applying just enough energy to maintain awareness without forcing or straining. Right mindfulness means paying attention to what is actually happening in this moment, rather than being lost in thoughts about the past or future. And right concentration means developing the stability of mind that allows us to see through the illusions that create suffering to the peace that is always available underneath. As the Buddha shared these teachings with his first students, something beautiful began to happen that would be repeated countless times throughout his 45 years of teaching. One by one, these 5 sincere seekers began to recognize the truth of what he was pointing toward, not as a philosophy to believe in, but as a direct perception of their own nature that had always been present but had been overlooked. They realized that what they had been seeking through years of difficult practices was actually closer to them than their own breath, more intimate than their own thoughts. The first to understand completely was Kondana, whose face lit up with the joy of recognition as he suddenly saw through the illusion that had kept him feeling separate from the peace he sought. "I see it," he exclaimed, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who has just discovered a treasure that had been hidden in plain sight. "What you are pointing toward is not something to be achieved, but something to be recognized. It is what I have always been beneath all the seeking and striving." One by one, the others experienced similar moments of awakening, each finding his own way to the same recognition that the Buddha had discovered beneath the Bodhi tree. They became the first members of the Sangha, the community of those who had awakened to their true nature, and their joy in this discovery was so infectious that it began to attract other seekers who sensed that something extraordinary was happening in their presence. As word spread about this teacher who had found a way beyond suffering, people began to come from far and wide to hear what he had to share. The Buddha welcomed them all with the same compassion he had shown to his first students, adapting his teaching to meet each person exactly where they were in their understanding, while never compromising the essential simplicity of the truth he had discovered. To some, he offered detailed instructions for meditation and mindfulness practice. To others, he spoke simply about the importance of treating all beings with kindness and living with integrity in their daily activities. He taught farmers how to find peace in the rhythms of planting and harvesting, merchants how to conduct business with honesty and compassion, parents how to raise children with wisdom and patience, and rulers how to govern with justice and humility. But whether he was speaking to kings or beggars, scholars or simple villagers, his message was always fundamentally the same. You already have everything you need for peace, and the only thing standing between you and the happiness you seek is the belief that you are separate from it. The Buddha's daily life became a living demonstration of the teachings he shared with others. He moved through the world with a presence that was both completely peaceful and fully engaged, showing by his example that awakening does not mean withdrawal from life, but rather complete participation in life, without the suffering that comes from resistance and attachment. This moment, right now, is your teacher, he would often remind his students, and his own way of being illustrated perfectly what it means to learn from each experience that arises without being overwhelmed by it. For 45 years, until his physical form could no longer sustain the energy of teaching, the Buddha wandered throughout India sharing this simple but profound message with all who were ready to hear it. He established no permanent institutions, wrote no books, and claimed no special authority beyond the authority of truth itself. Instead, he simply pointed consistently and patiently toward the freedom that is every being's birthright, trusting that those who were ready would recognize what he was indicating and find their own way to the same liberation he had discovered. His final message to his followers was characteristic of the practical wisdom he had shared throughout his teaching career. "Be a light unto yourself," he told them as his life drew toward its close. "Do not depend on my words or anyone else's words to tell you what is true, but discover for yourself the peace that lies at the heart of your own being." The Buddha's awakening is your awakening, for there has never been any difference between the consciousness that awakened in me and the consciousness that is looking through your eyes right now. And so the great wheel of teaching that began beneath the Bodhi tree continues to turn, carried forward, not by institutions or traditions, but by each person who discovers for themselves that the peace they seek is not something to be found, but something to be recognized as what they have always been. The story of the Buddha is not ancient history, but a description of the possibility that exists in every moment for every being who is willing to stop fighting reality long enough to discover the freedom that has always been waiting, patiently beneath the surface of seeking. Tonight, as you rest in the peace that this ancient story has awakened in your own heart, know that you too carry within yourself the same Buddha nature that manifested so completely in the Prince, who gave up everything to find what you already are. Let yourself sink into the recognition that this moment, exactly as it is, contains everything you have ever been looking for, Rest in the understanding that the journey to enlightenment is simply the journey home to yourself, and you are already here. May this story find you in whatever way serves your highest good, and may you discover for yourself the deathless peace that no external circumstance can disturb and no passage of time can diminish. The Buddha's gift to the world was not a new religion, but the reminder that suffering is optional and peace is always available to those who stop resisting what is and start embracing what they are. Sweet dreams, dear friends, and may you awaken to the truth that sets all beings free.